Hi everyone. Last October, I released a video where I was basically making an illustrated summary of Dracula in an animatic style. Flash forward to June 2026, and I've only actually released two parts because it's taking longer than I thought because of life stuff and also just because the project is way bigger than I initially thought, and I've been also struggling with motivation. I don't know how long it'll take me to finish the whole thing, but I actually recorded all the audio for the summary last August/September, and it's kind of been stressing me out how it's just been sitting around. So what I've decided to do is release just the audio summary accompanied by this roughly ×2 speed drawing of an AU version of Jonathan and Mina Harker, so people at least have the audio summary to listen to, as well as just reduce the pressure on myself regarding the animatics, because I am still working on it, but I don't want to force myself to do stuff on it if I'm not feeling motivated and just ruin the enjoyment of it, because this is all just something that I'm doing for fun. I also do technically still have a whole webcomic to finish as well. I seriously don't know why I do this to myself. But yeah, anyway, I hope you enjoy this summary. Take it away past me, and here is a brief illustrated, well, it's not really illustrated, is it? And here is a brief summary of Dracula. Also, massive spoilers for the entire book and a little bit for Nosferatu 2024. Now, let's begin at last. The story starts off with Jonathan Harker on his way to Transylvania to conduct some business for a Count Dracula. Jonathan is a solicitor working for a Mr. Hawkins in Exeter, who is also a bit like Jonathan's father figure, and Dracky has basically employed Mr. Hawkins to manage his affairs as he plans to move to London, but he needs someone to come in person to help him sort out the paperwork, so Mr. Hawkins sends our Johnny boy. So Jonathan is writing in his journal as he travels from England to Transylvania and makes a note of interesting things here and there, in particular things he plans to share with his fiancée Mina Murray, who is back in England. Side note, I really love the relationship between Mina and Jonathan because they're so clearly devoted to each other, and I think it's kind of sad how in a lot of adaptations of Dracula they throw away that relationship just to put Mina and Dracula together. So justice for my man Jonathan. No one is husbanding better than you, and that is the hill I will die on. Anyway, once Jonathan makes it to Transylvania, he stays at a hotel and has some odd encounters with the locals, particularly when they realise that he's going to the Count's castle. The inn lady begs him not to go or to delay his journey by another day, but he refuses because he received another letter from Dracula that morning saying he would have a coach waiting for John at the mountain pass. As the inn lady can't convince him, she gives him a rosary to wear instead. Jonathan gets ready to set off, but before he goes, he sees a small crowd of people by the inn just watching him with pity. They all cross themselves and say something, which kind of freaks him out, but he can't really understand the language, so he just feels unsettled. He tries to translate a few words and thinks they're saying hell, Satan, and either werewolf or vampire, which does nothing to improve his mood. In the carriage, he's with a few other passengers who all seem quite nervous, and when they get to the meeting spot by evening, the driver makes a big show of Dracky's coach not being there, so they probably weren't actually expecting him and they should just go back and try a different day. Jonathan suspects the driver was rushing to get there extra early and is now trying to make him go away when Dracky's coach pulls up, complete with a creepy coachman and everything. Mr. Creepy Coachman with the gleaming teeth and red eyes implies that he knows the other coach driver tried to trick him by coming early, and honestly, shout out to all the townspeople for trying to save Jonathan from his fate. But anyway, the coach driver and the passengers have no choice but to hand over Jonathan's luggage and say farewell. Jonathan notes how strong the creepy coachman seems to be, given that he can carry all his luggage in one hand, but is currently still kind of oblivious. Before he gets driven away, however, he sees the normal coachman and the remaining passengers all cross themselves and gets freaked out again. The journey to Dracky's castle is not pleasant for Johnny Boy. He gets the impression that they're going around in circles and notices weird lights in the distance and hears wolves chasing them. At one point, Mr. Creepy Coachman stops and gets down, disappearing into the forest for a while, and Jonathan realises he's surrounded by wolves. He tries to shout to make them go away, but they don't listen to him. The creepy coachman suddenly returns and commands the wolves to leave, which they do. He then gets back on the coach and they drive off, finally making it to the Count's castle. Once they arrive, the creepy coachman puts all Jonathan's luggage down in front of the main door and drives off. Jonathan notices again how strong he seems to be, but is left standing there all alone in the dark. He waits for so long that he starts to think he might just have to wait outside all night when the door opens to reveal none other than Count Dracula. When Jonathan steps inside and shakes his hand, which is ice cold, he He notes that the Count seems to have extraordinary strength, exactly like the coachman whom he hadn't seen. Suspicious. Dracula carries in all Jonathan's luggage by himself, saying his servants aren't available because it's so late, and sees him to his rooms. Jonathan finds supper already laid out for him and eats alone, as Dracula says he ate already. The two of them then sit by the fire, and Jonathan is able to get a closer look at Dracula's appearance, noticing he has slightly pointy ears, very sharp teeth, and especially red lips. He isn't quite able to hide his discomfort, especially when Dracula comes closer and makes strange remarks about wolves, and they end up sitting together for a while until day breaks and Dracula sends him off to bed. The next day, Jonathan wakes up late and is left all alone. As he wanders around, he notices that there doesn't seem to be a single mirror in the house or any other people. He eventually finds a library full of all sorts of books about England, and Dracula later finds him there that evening. Dracula asks Jonathan to tell him all there is to know about life in London and about the property he recently purchased, which is a rundown estate called Carfax that has an old chapel attached to it and a private asylum next door. He also asks John to correct him on his English pronunciation because he doesn't want it to be obvious when he's there that he's a foreigner. Dracula tells Jonathan that he can go anywhere in the castle he likes except where the doors are locked, and they end up talking again until dawn. Jonathan gets sent to bed again, but he's only able to sleep for a few hours before getting up and decides to try and shave. He has a tiny little mirror as part of his shaving kit, so he ends up using that, but cuts himself when he gets startled by Dracula, who he didn't see coming up behind him. At first, he thinks it must have been a trick, but when he looks in the mirror again, he realises for sure that the Count is not appearing in the mirror, despite being directly behind Jonathan. When Dracula notices the cut on Jonathan's face, he seems to suddenly become enraged and tries to grab Jonathan's throat, but when his fingers touch Jonathan's rosary, he calms down and warns him about the dangers of cutting himself before claiming the mirror is a symbol of vanity and throwing it out the window. Dracula then sweeps off, leaving Jonathan all alone, and Jonathan notes the view, seeing that the castle is over a large cliff drop on 3 sides with a forest for miles around the rest. When he goes to explore the castle, he realises the entire place is full of locked doors, with the only way out being the windows, and that he is essentially a prisoner in the castle. Once Johnny Boy calms down from this revelation, he realises he needs to keep his fears to himself, and his eyes open as Dracula is obviously going to try and gaslight, gatekeep, girlboss him. He hears Dracula coming back and quietly sneaks up to his room, spying Dracula making his bed and laying the table, which confirms his fears that there are no other people in the castle. This also makes Jonathan realise that it must have been Dracula driving the coach on the first night, and that he can somehow control the wolves. He feels particularly grateful to the old inn lady for giving him the crucifix, even though he's a Protestant, and decides that he's going to try and gather more information from Dracula. For the next few days, Jonathan and Dracula fall into a routine where they talk in the evening and until dawn, but he's left mostly to his own devices during daylight hours. Jonathan learns specifically about the history of the Draculas, with Dracula talking almost like he was there, and he also gets questioned a lot by Dracula about how solicitors work in England and whether he can have multiple different ones in different places, implying that he doesn't want any one person to know his business. He also coerces Jonathan to write to Mr. Hawkins to tell him he's going to stay for another month, and Jonathan agrees, knowing he doesn't really have a choice. Dracula makes it clear that Jonathan should be careful what he writes, as the envelopes are so thin he can read what's written. So Jonathan writes to Mr. Hawkins and Mina for Dracula, but decides he's going to write secret letters to both of them, using shorthand for Mina's letter because they often communicate that way. Dracula briefly leaves the room, and Jonathan tries to spy on some of Dracula's own letters, spotting several names and addresses to different solicitors and bankers, but Dracula comes back, so Jonathan has to go back to what he was doing. Before leaving, Dracula also gives Jonathan a warning not to sleep in any other part of the castle except for his own rooms for his own safety. Jonathan tries to take a moment to breathe and decides, actually, I'll sleep where I like, as long as Dracula's not around, and he goes to the window to get some fresh air. He feels a brief moment of relief at first, even though it's still night, but then he sees Dracula slowly coming out of another window on the other side of the castle, and to his horror, start crawling face down the wall. Jonathan watches Dracula do the same thing on a different night, and decides that now is his chance to explore the castle more thoroughly, since he knows Dracula isn't home, but he finds that the front door is locked. He ends up in the right wing of the castle after forcing his way through a rusted door, and finds a lady's room with a little table that he uses to take the opportunity to update his diary. He ends up falling asleep on a couch, basically determined to disobey Dracula, but during the night he wakes up briefly and realises he isn't alone. Under his eyelashes he can see 3 young women in the room with him, 1 blonde and 2 dark-haired that have similar features to Dracula. Now, it's likely that the blonde one may be Dracula's wife and the other 2 his relatives, but since it's not made clear in the book, I will be referring to all 3 of them as Dracula's wives because it's easier that way and also pop culture. Anyway, Dracula's wives approach Jonathan and he notes they're all very beautiful with voluptuous lips lips, which gives him the sudden desire for them to kiss him. Now, this is one of the 2 moments in the book that I will be side-eyeing Jonathan, like, dude, you have a fiancé, but I will give him a pass here because he's kind of under their spell. He hears the wives whispering to each other that there will be kisses for them all, and the blonde one should go first, and Jonathan feels her kneeling down beside him and putting her lips and teeth on his neck. Before anything can happen, however, the atmosphere of the room changes and Dracula arrives in a rage, throwing the wife back and warning them all that Jonathan belongs to him. Then there's a moment where Dracula stares at Jonathan's face and softly tells the wives that he too can love. Okay, Dracula, very suspicious. Anyway, he tells the wives they can kiss Jonathan as much as they want when he's done with him, then tosses them a sack with a child in it for dinner. The wives snatch up the sack and fade away without using the door, which causes Jonathan to faint in horror. The next morning, Jonathan wakes up back in his room and updates his diary about the whole thing. He now realises that his safety is entirely at the mercy of Dracula for as long as he's useful. He notes that his clothes aren't folded like he usually does them, and his watch is unwound, so he's not sure if what he experienced was entirely real or if it's all a sign that he's losing his mind. He is glad, however, that Dracula didn't find the diary, otherwise he would have definitely destroyed it. He goes back down to the same rooms, this time during the day, and checks but finds that the door is tightly locked and decides it definitely wasn't a dream and that he needs to do something quickly. Dracky comes to him the next day and tells him to write 3 letters to Mina and Mr. Hawkins. 1 to say that he's nearly finished with his work, 1 that he is just setting off, and 1 that said he had arrived at the next town, and Dracula makes him put future dates on them for up to a month in advance. Dracula uses the pretense that the post is unreliable, so it's better that all the letters are written and held at the next town to be sent off until the right time. But Jonathan knows it's so the alarm bells aren't raised immediately when he goes missing. He decides he can't openly disobey Dracula and make him suspicious, so his best chance is to just obey and quietly wait for an opportunity to escape. At this point, both of them know that Jonathan knows too much to be allowed to live. A group of travelling people soon come to the castle about a week later, and Jonathan seizes the opportunity to try and escape. He speaks to the travelling people through the window and tosses them the secret letters to Mina and Mr. Hawkins, along with some coins. He tries to indicate to them to post the letters, as he can't understand their language, and they seem to understand him, so he feels hopeful. Dracula later comes in with those 2 letters. He makes a show of telling Jonathan that, of course he'll post the letter to Mr. Hawkins. Jonathan just needs to reseal it because he accidentally opened it, you know? The other one, though, has weird symbols on it, and it's unsigned, so it obviously must not have anything to do with them, so he tosses them into the fire. Dracula then cheerfully advises John to go to bed, and as he leaves, quietly locks him in. The next day, Jonathan wakes up and finds all of his documents are gone, as well as anything that might have helped him outside the castle. Not only that, every scrap of paper in the room has been taken away, and his travelling suit and coat have been stolen. Jonathan is then left in this limbo with the Count for 2 weeks, but gets another brief glimpse of hope when another group of people come to the castle. He tries to meet them in the courtyard, but finds the door to his room is locked again from the outside. When he cries to them from the window, the leader of the group of travelling people from earlier comes out and tells them he's crazy, and everyone laughs at him. After that point, they all ignore him and get busy unloading a bunch of large boxes before leaving. He can later hear the travelling people working on something for Dracula and digging somewhere else in the castle. A week later, and a few days before the final date on the letters Dracula made him write, Jonathan sees Dracky crawling out of his window again. To his shock, he sees that Dracula is wearing his own clothes that had been stolen and is also carrying the bag that had held the kidnapped child in it. He realised Dracula plans to be seen in the next town wearing Jonathan's clothes, so others can confirm that he's been spotted travelling and posting his own letters, as well as blame him for any evil doing that Dracky does whilst he's there. Jonathan feels enraged at this and sits at the window to watch for Dracula's return, when suddenly he notices some specks floating around outside the moonlight. They start to hypnotise him, but then he realises they're forming into the shapes of the 3 wives, and he runs away again in terror back to his own room. When he later tries to open the doors again, he finds that they've locked by themselves, so he just sits there and cries for a long time. And honestly, poor Jonathan, like, what a terrible ordeal. Genuinely, I would have broken down. After a while, Jonathan hears the cries of a woman outside and gets up and goes to the window. When she spots him, she starts screaming at him, calling him a monster and telling him to give her back her child. Jonathan hears Dracky's voice call down from high above, and he summons a bunch of wolves who devour the woman, so R.I.P. Jonathan feels spurred into action the next day when he sees the sunrise and wonders, since he never actually sees Dracula during the day, whether he sleeps during this time. He hatches a plan to try and sneak into Dracky's room by going out through the window the same way he's seen Dracula do, which is very brave. I know I definitely don't have the guts for something like that. He manages to make the climb down and slips into Dracky's room without falling to his death, but to his surprise finds Dracula's room is almost entirely empty, with everything being covered in layers of dust. There's a pile of ancient gold coins in one corner, as well as a bunch of other old ornaments, but Jonathan isn't able to find any keys to the main door. He spots another heavy door across the room and finds that it's open, so goes through and down a flight of stairs and another passage until he finally ends up in an old ruined chapel. There's another door leading down to some vaults, but Jonathan searches every inch of the place first for a key. He finds that the earth from the chapel has been dug up and placed into the boxes he saw the men bringing earlier, and that there are 50 of them in total. To his shock, when he finally goes down into one of the vaults, he sees Dracula lying in one of the boxes with his eyes open, looking almost like a corpse. He gets frightened by the expression on the Count's face and runs back into his room, abandoning his search for the keys. The date of the last fake letter arrives, and Jonathan spots Dracula leaving the castle in his clothes again to post it. When he gets back, he tells Jonathan that it's time to part ways and says his carriage will have to come tomorrow because his coachman and horses are busy tonight. Jonathan challenges this by demanding to leave now, saying he'll literally walk if he has to and he doesn't care about his luggage either. Dracula smiles at him and agrees, saying he won't keep him there another hour if that's what he wants. They go down to the main door, which, to Jonathan's surprise, is unlocked, and Dracula starts to open it. Outside, Dracula sees some howling wolves snapping at him and realises Dracula will happily let him get eaten by the wolves, so he relents and begs Dracula to close the door, defeatedly agreeing to wait until the morning. They go back to his room and Dracula leaves him there with a smile. Jonathan goes to his door where he can hear the Count's voice faintly and hears him telling the wives to be patient and that they can have him tomorrow night. Jonathan, in a rage, flings the door open and sees the wives licking their lips. Again, he is much braver than I would be in this situation. When they see him, they all laugh and the wives run away. Jonathan wakes up just before dawn the next day and runs down to try and get out the front door, but finds it's locked again in the morning. He decides he's going to get that front door key from Dracula, even if it kills him, and scales the wall again to get to the Count's room and back into the chapel. He finds Dracula asleep in one of the boxes again, but to his horror, notes that he looks younger now and almost bloated, with fresh blood on his lips. Jonathan searches Dracula's body for a key, but can't find it. He gets seized with the desire to end Dracula then and there and prevent him from feeding on people in London, so he grabs a shovel and tries to brain him, but Dracula's head turns and gives him a grin so terrifying that the shovel just bounces off Dracu's forehead, leaving a gash. Jonathan then hears the sound of the travelling people coming back and rushes back to hide in the Count's room. He hears them hammering down and packing up the boxes to take away, and then they leave, and he's once again trapped. Jonathan knows that he's now alone in the castle with the wives and decides there is absolutely no way he's going to let them get to him, so he takes some of Dracula's gold coins and decides he's going to continue to scale the wall down as far as he can go or die trying. He updates his journal with his plans, saying his goodbyes to the people he loves, especially Mina, and takes the plunge. Back in England, Mina Murray currently works as a schoolmistress and writes to her childhood friend Lucy Westenra. She plans to visit her soon and tells her about how she's learning shorthand and working on her studies so she can be useful to Jonathan with his work once they're married. She also sneakily asks Lucy to elaborate on some juicy rumours about a handsome gentleman she's been seen with in London. Lucy replies to her and says that the man was a Mr. Arthur Holmwood who has been visiting her a lot recently, and that he introduced her to another man called Dr. John Seward who runs a private lunatic asylum. A private lunatic asylum. Now, where have I heard that before? Anyway, she tells Mina that Seward would have been a perfect match for Mina if she wasn't already with John. She admits that she's in love with Arthur and later writes to Mina with some even juicier news, saying that she got 3 marriage proposals in one day. The first was from Dr. Seward, the second was from a rich American nepo baby called Quincy Morris, and the last was from Arthur. Obviously, she had to reject the first 2 because she's in love with Arthur, and the other 2 men both graciously accepted her refusal and asked her to still rely on them as friends if she ever needed anything. Lucy's very sweet and cried on their behalf because she felt so bad for hurting them both, but she's over the moon about the fact that she's going to marry Arthur. In a different letter from Quincy to Arthur, we also find out that he, Arthur and Seward are all old friends who used to go travelling and hunting in America, and both Quincy and Seward invite Arthur out for drinks to celebrate his good news, assuring him that there aren't any hard feelings. Seward is still pretty bummed out about the rejection though, and decides he's going to distract himself by studying a patient in his asylum called Renfield. After a little while, Lucy returns from London to the town of Whitby, and Mina joins her there for her visit. Mina takes to hanging out in the graveyard at Whitby because it has a nice view overlooking the coast, and often chats with a group of local old men, especially their bossy leader called Mr. Swales, who uses my favourite phrase in this whole book, yablins. I need to figure out a way to start using that in my daily life. Yablins. Anyway, she also brings Lucy a few times, and the old men immediately like her because she's very sweet and also really pretty. And I promise you, there is no one in this book who fawns over Lucy more than Mina. I love them. Lucy's character assassination is another thing that I absolutely hate about a lot of adaptations of Dracula. Justice for both of my girls. But yeah, Mina and Lucy often spend a lot of time looking over the view from the graveyard, with Lucy just telling Mina how excited she is to be marrying Arthur. It makes Mina feel a bit heartsick because at that point it's been over a month since she last heard from Jonathan. Meanwhile, back in London, Seward continues to study Renfield, who continues to be weird. He notes that Renfield has recently started catching flies by tempting them with his own food. When Seward tells him he can't be keeping that many flies in his room, Renfield agrees to clear them all in 3 days, then starts catching spiders, which he feeds the flies to. The spiders eventually also become a problem, and Seward tells him to clear some of them out as well, to which Renfield cheerfully eats a fly and agrees. A few days later, Renfield has a nice group of birds he's befriended and has been feeding spiders too. He asks Seward for a kitten. Now, Seward has kind of clocked on to Renfield's shenanigans and slyly asks if he wouldn't prefer to have a cat instead. Renfield eagerly agrees, saying he only asked for a kitten because he was worried Seward would refuse to let him have a cat. Now, Seward doesn't actually want Renfield to feed all of his birds to a cat, but decides to test him in a very non-GMC approved way because he suspects Renfield has some homicidal tendencies and wants to see what will happen. He tells him, "We'll see," but later decides no when Renfield begs him again, which leaves Renfield very upset. The next day, Seward is surprised to find Renfield cheerfully catching flies again, but this time all the birds are gone, with only a few feathers and a drop of blood on Renfield's pillow. Later that day, he gets called by an attendant and finds that Renfield has vomited up a large amount of feathers, having eaten all of his birds raw. Seward, instead of behaving normally, drugs Renfield to make him sleep and steals his notebook so he can look through it. He discovers that Renfield wants to absorb lives and is trying to do it in a cumulative way. He feels strongly tempted to let the experiment continue just to see what would happen after the cat, but decides against it. And honestly, this is one of the many reasons in this book that make me want to fight Seward. I cannot express enough how much I want to fight this man. He is a walking medical misconduct lawsuit, if only psychiatric patients had rights back in those days. Anyway, back in Whitby, Mina gets anxious about Jonathan. She ended up writing to Mr. Hawkins when she still hadn't heard from him, and he replied and sent her Jonathan's most recent letter that he'd just received. It said he was setting off from Castle Dracula, but this doesn't alleviate her worries at all, as she feels like the letters don't really sound how Jonathan usually writes. On top of this, Lucy has restarted her childhood habit of sleepwalking, which her late father also used to do, and it makes both her mother, Mrs. Westenra, and Mina quite anxious. Mina has started locking their bedroom door and regularly gets woken up by Lucy trying the handle and then searching for the key in her sleep. Later, whilst Lucy and her mother are out on a social call, she goes back up to the graveyard to watch the sea where it seems like a storm is coming in. She ends up meeting Old Man Swales, who apologises to Mina for all the times he's been gruff with her. He feels like there's something foul in the winds and it's telling him that death is coming for him soon, especially since he's almost 100 years old. This makes Mina cry, and he tries to reassure her that he's content and not afraid of dying, says a prayer and then hobbles off. Mina is left alone and sad, but a member of the Coast Guard comes by and stops to chat with her, pointing out an odd Russian ship coming into port that seems to be steering weirdly and tossing about in the waves. Now, the story shifts from diaries to some letters written to a newspaper that Mina has cut out and pasted into her journal. The articles discuss how the storm that night was one of the greatest and most sudden in Whitby's records. Seeing the thunderclouds, most of the ships in Whitby all stayed in the harbour that night, aside from one weird foreign ship that had all of its sails set. When the storm finally broke, the officers got out the new searchlight they had to try and guide any remaining ships into the harbour, with a crowd on shore cheering each time a ship safely made it in. Eventually, the searchlight spotted the same weird ship being tossed around and watched as it suddenly barreled into the harbour, not stopping until it beached itself and crashed into the sand. The crowd all realised in horror that there was a corpse tied to the helm of the ship, and that the ship had basically been unsteered this whole time, seemingly being carried in by the waves and some weird fog. On top of that, as soon as the ship crashed and touched the land, a massive black dog jumped off deck and ran into the night in the direction of the graveyard. The Coast Guard ran onto the ship and were horrified by something, which caused the crowd, including the correspondent writing the letters to the newspaper, to all run down to see. The correspondent was able to get permission to come aboard whilst the rest of the crowd were held back, and he found that the dead man was tied by both hands to the wheel with a crucifix wrapped around his hand and the wheel. The man had been dead for at least 2 days, and there was a bottle in his pocket containing an addendum to the ship's log. It was also obvious that the man had tied himself to the wheel of the ship. Later on, the correspondent describes how the ship was a Russian vessel from Varna called the Demeter, and the only cargo was some silver sand and a bunch of big wooden boxes full of dirt. The boxes were collected by a solicitor called Mr. Billington, aka one of the names Jonathan had spied on Dracula's letters. The correspondent also mentions how the dog from the ship still hadn't been found, and that was concerning to the locals because recently another large dog turned up dead and mangled after fighting something. The correspondent was also able to get a copy copy of the ship's log in the bottle after the inquiry about the whole thing was completed, and had it translated and written up in his letter where it got published in the newspaper. Essentially, the log was written by the ship's captain about strange happenings going on during the journey, and is one of my favourite bits in the book. So, the ship set off with 9 crew members, and initially nothing was wrong. After about a week, the captain notices all the crew seem frightened about something, but when the first mate asks them what's wrong, they all just cross themselves and say nothing. A few days later, one of the crew members goes missing after finishing his watch, and the men, though upset, tell the captain that they expected something like this to happen. This makes the first mate lose his temper, as he thinks it's all superstitious nonsense. The captain is later approached by one of the crew members who tells him he thinks there's a strange man on the ship, and that he saw him come out from below deck, then walk to the bow and disappear. The men all search the ship, except for inside the boxes, and they find nothing, so the men are all able to cheerfully return to work. A week later, another crew member has disappeared. The crew asks to work in doubles when they take watch, and the captain agrees, though this angers the first mate again. Unfortunately, the crew is then hit with a load of bad weather, and as no one has been able to sleep, the second mate volunteers to steer and do the watch alone so the others can rest. The next day, he's gone. The captain and first mate agree to arm themselves from that point on and keep an eye out as the crew are in a panic. They start to get near England, which cheers the captain up a little, and he's finally able to get a good night's sleep. But the next morning, the first mate wakes him up and tells him that both the watchman and the steersman from last night are missing. Only 4 of them are now left on the ship. The crew are now in the English Channel, but they get caught by some unnatural fog that keeps them from being able to signal for help and forces them to drift helplessly in the water. The captain is woken up by a cry, and he runs up onto the deck into the fog. He runs into the first mate, who tells him he can't find any sign of the man on watch. When the captain goes up the next night to relieve the man on the wheel, he also finds no one there. Now, only the captain and first mate are left on the ship. The mate approaches the captain, looking crazed, and tells him last night he saw the thing on the ship. He crept up behind it with his knife, but when he went to attack the thing, the knife passed completely through and the thing was gone. He tells the captain to continue to work at the helm whilst he goes down to the hold to check all the boxes. A little while later, the captain hears the first mate scream, and then sees him run out like a madman and throw himself overboard. The captain starts to wonder if the mate was mad all along and was the one actually killing and getting rid of the men. He stays at the helm all night, too afraid to go below deck, and sees a thin man come up from below. He realises the mate was right to jump overboard, but decides he can't abandon his ship as the captain, and so puts his log entries into a bottle in his pocket and ties his hands to the wheel with a crucifix as protection. Obviously, given the correspondent's article, this didn't really help him, and the correspondent finishes his letter by writing how the inquiry came up with nothing, as they didn't really have any evidence about what actually happened or whether or not the captain was mad. The court ended up deciding that Captain was a hero and that he'll be receiving a public funeral with honours. The story then returns to Mina's journal proper, and she writes about how during the storm, Lucy was especially restless and tried to sleepwalk outside several times during the night. Luckily, Mina woke up each time just in time and got her back into bed before she could actually go out. She and Lucy go up to the graveyard a few days later to watch the funeral procession for the captain of the Demeter, and Mina notes that Lucy has been especially restless and upset all day. She thinks it's due to the fact that poor old Mr. Swales was found dead that morning on their usual seat in the graveyard. The men that found him think he must have had some sort of awful shock, which made him start back and break his neck. One of the other regulars at the graveyard also comes up with his dog to see the service with Lucy and Mina, but the dog refuses to join them at the seat. Normally the man and the dog are both very quiet and calm, but the man, after unsuccessfully trying to coax the dog towards them, gets angry and kicks the dog before forcing it to sit on the tomb next to the seat. Mina notes that Lucy is also very upset by the poor dog cowering on the tombstone for the rest of the service, and decides to take her for a long walk after the funeral to tire her out, as she's worried it will all be additional fuel for her sleepwalking. Unfortunately, her plan was entirely unsuccessful. Well, I mean, she does manage to tire Lucy out with their walk, which included them getting frightened by some cows, and goes to bed satisfied with herself that Lucy is now sleeping soundly and prettily. Side note, once again, there are few people in this book who have a bigger crush on Lucy than Mina, and it's quite funny the contrast of this coming right after Mina spent some time disparaging women who want more rights and independence for themselves. Like Mina, girl, I love you, but get a grip. Anyway, she writes about how happy she is that Lucy seems better and thinks the sleepwalking troubles are all over now. She's woken up later that night with an awful feeling and realises that Lucy isn't in her bed and that their bedroom door is no longer locked. Mrs. Westenra has been ill lately, so Lucy doesn't want to wake her and instead puts on some clothes and searches the house for Lucy. As she sees Lucy hasn't taken her dressing gown or dress, she thinks she must still be nearby, but soon realises she's nowhere in the house and finds the main door slightly open. With no time to think, Mina grabs a shawl and runs out into the night. She soon spots a white figure in the distance, sitting in their favourite seat by the graveyard, and though she can't see properly from the distance, it looks like there's something dark behind the white figure, leaning over it. Mina doesn't waste any more time time trying to get a better look and just runs over to the graveyard, where she does indeed find Lucy with a dark figure leaning over her. Mina calls out in shock to Lucy, and the figure looks up for a second to reveal a white face and red eyes, and Mina rushes to go and get Lucy. For a brief moment, the church obscures Mina's view of Lucy, and when she finally reaches her, she finds Lucy half reclining in the seat, fast asleep, and all by herself. Lucy seems to be breathing quite heavily and lifts up the collar of her nightgown like she's cold, so Mina throws the shawl over her and fastens it around her neck with a safety pin. She puts her own shoes on Lucy's feet and tries to gently wake her, but when that doesn't work, she shakes her forcefully, which brings Lucy round. After the obligatory compliment about how pretty Lucy is, Mina gets her up and they start back home. Lucy tries to insist on Mina taking back her shoes, but Mina refuses and instead cakes her feet in mud to avoid making it obvious that she's barefoot. They have to hide in a doorway to avoid attracting the attention of a drunk passerby, but they manage to make it back to the house without meeting anyone. This is very lucky for them, because if they'd been spotted, it would have destroyed their reputations, especially Lucy, who was only wearing a nightdress. As Mina's tucking Lucy back into bed, Lucy begs her not to tell her mother, and Mina eventually agrees due to Mrs. Westenra's poor health, and also to avoid the story getting out or becoming distorted. She locks their bedroom door again, and this time goes to sleep with the key around her wrist. The next day, everything is back to normal again, and Mina is relieved to see Lucy doesn't seem to have been affected by being out all night in the cold, though she does notice that Lucy has 2 small pinpricks on her neck and feels guilty for being so clumsy with the safety pin when she was putting the shawl on Lucy. They continue to pass their days cheerfully, but Mina notes that Lucy continues to sleepwalk, and this time seems to be more impatient when she finds the door locked. She wakes up one night and spots Lucy sitting up in bed, pointing to the window. When Mina opens the curtain, a large bat flies away. She later notes that Lucy has become very fond of going to the graveyard and sitting in their usual spot, and often she wants to stay late. One day, Mina isn't able to get her away before the sun starts to set, and notices Lucy seems to enter a dreamy state, muttering something about his red eyes. When Mina looks over to where Lucy's staring, she realises there's a stranger sitting in their seat, and for a second it looks almost like his eyes are burning. Lucy comes back to herself and they return home, with Lucy going straight to bed because she has a headache. Mina locks her in her room and goes out for a late walk, feeling sad, thinking about how she still hasn't heard from Jonathan. As she gets back to the house, she looks up and spots Lucy leaning out of the window. She waves, but after a few moments realises Lucy is actually still asleep, and there's something that looks like a large bird next to her. Mina runs up to their room, worried Lucy will catch a cold. When she gets to their room, she finds Lucy gasping for breath again, holding her throat. She tucks the still asleep Lucy back into bed, and this time securely fastens the window, noting Lucy looks a bit more tired and unwell than usual. When they all go down to breakfast the next day, Lucy again seems more tired, but cheers up when she hears from Arthur that his father, who is a lord by the way and has recently been ill, has gotten better, so they'll hopefully be able to get married soon. Mrs. Westenra is very happy but also seems sad, and later quietly tells Mina that her doctor has said that she probably will only live for a few more months due to a heart condition. Mina is very glad she never informed Mrs. Westenra about the late night sleepwalking incident, as the shock would have probably killed her. She continues to keep an eye on Lucy, but can't seem to explain why she's becoming weaker and weaker, and keeps finding her sitting at the open window at night. She notices the wounds on her neck haven't healed yet and seem to be getting bigger, so resolves on insisting Lucy sees a doctor if they don't improve soon. Mina's journal entries are interrupted here with a few letters from the solicitor at Whitby to some delivery men in London. Essentially, the 50 boxes of earth from Castle Dracula have been transferred to the chapel at Carfax Estate, which is the new property Dracula bought with Jonathan and Mr. Hawkins' help. Back to Mina's journal proper, she notes that Lucy seems to be returning to herself and seems more healthy again. On top of that, her joy is increased because she finally has news about Jonathan. It turns out Jonathan has been staying at a hospital in Budapest for the last 6 weeks. The sister at the hospital writes to Mina and Mr. Hawkins on Jonathan's behalf, telling them that he's been delirious with a brain fever, though he now seems to be much better and will be staying at the sanatorium a few more weeks before being discharged. He hasn't lost his mind, but he does seem to be mentally broken and has been raving about wolves and demons during his delirious episodes. Mina decides to set off for the hospital at once, with Lucy taking the rest of her clothes to London, as Lucy will be going back there soon. Elsewhere, Seward records in his journal that there's been a sudden change in Renfield and that he's been sniffing around like a dog and talking about his master being near. Seward suspects religious mania and tries to ask him about his spiders, but Renfield doesn't seem to care about them anymore. Seward later wonders whether he should dose himself up with some chloroform to get a good night's sleep, as he's been thinking about Lucy again, but decides against it because he doesn't want to dishonour Lucy by associating her memory with drug use. He feels very glad he decided not to treat himself to some drugs when later that night he gets woken up by his attendants, who inform him that Renfield has escaped through a window. Seward sees Renfield scaling a wall in the distance and chases after him onto the grounds of Carfax. He follows Renfield as he runs right up to the chapel door, then creeps slowly behind him. Seward hears Renfield whispering through the door of the chapel to a master who he promises to faithfully follow. Seward and the attendants pounce on him, and Renfield fights wildly, revealing his strength to Seward's alarm. They put him in a straitjacket and chain him to a wall, where Renfield continues to alternate between yelling to his master and then going quiet. And man, I know this is a horror story and Renfield is obviously talking to Dracula, but Victorian treatment of mental health patients is terrifying. They literally chained him to a wall. Anyway, Mina, now in Budapest, writes to Lucy to tell her she's arrived safely and is with Jonathan. He's a wreck of himself and he seems to have some amnesia about what happened to him. The sister in charge won't tell Mina what Jonathan was raving about when he was off his head. A direct quote from the book, by the way, love it, citing patient confidentiality, and crosses herself. She does, however, inform Mina that his troubles aren't due to another woman. Mina laughs it off but is secretly happy that there are no other women involved, though we know that that's technically not entirely true. Also, not to miss another opportunity to bash Seward, but I think he could take a lesson from that nurse in patient care, but there will be plenty more moments in this book where Seward is a sketchy doctor. When Jonathan wakes up, Mina wants to have a look through his notebook, but he tells her he doesn't want to know what's in it because he's worried it'll make him mad again, and also that he wants to start his life anew with their marriage. He says she can read it if she really wants to, but asks if she'd be willing to share in his ignorance. Mina begs the hospital staff to arrange for her and Jonathan to be married that afternoon, as they both decided they would rather be married as soon as possible and don't want to wait to get back to England. The staff agree and the two are married by the end of the day. As a wedding present to John, she symbolically wraps up the journal and seals it with her wedding ring, promising to never read it again unless for his own sake. Jonathan takes her hand and tells her he'd go through all of the past again to win it. Man, I just love this couple so much. Anyway, Mina finishes her letter to Lucy by wishing her as much happiness in her own marriage to Arthur. Lucy replies with delight, wishing the two of them were with her in Whitby. She says she's recently stopped sleepwalking and that the date of her own wedding is set for the following month in September. Jumping back to Dr. Lawsuit, we learn that Seward has decided to let Renfield out of his straitjacket as he seems to have returned to normal. He tries to tempt Renfield into answering his question with the promise of cats, but Renfield refuses. The staff at the asylum notice over the next few days that he has developed a pattern of being violent all day, then being quiet all night, and seems to be under some kind of influence during sunrise and sunset. Seward plots to figure out the cause of this by orchestrating his escape again and having the attendants secretly follow him, but this ends up being a waste of time as Renfield decides to just hang out in his cell even when he realises the door is open. Just as Seward decides that they'll arrange to let Renfield out of his straitjacket and chains for a bit overnight, he gets called because Renfield has escaped again. They follow him again to the chapel door at Carfax, and when Renfield sees Seward, he becomes enraged and tries to kill him. Renfield struggles for a bit against the attendants before suddenly growing calm and agreeing to go back to his cell. Seward follows his gaze and notices him watching a large bat flying away and feels wary. In the meantime, Lucy has moved back to London from Whitby and has started to sleepwalk and become unwell again. She misses Mina and feels afraid of sleeping alone as she's been having bad dreams but can't remember them at all. On top of this, she feels like she can never get enough air and feels extremely weak. Well-known side effects of blood loss, by the way. Arthur notices this and writes to Seward to beg him to visit Lucy and figure out what's wrong with her. He doesn't want to discuss his worries with Mrs. Westenra as she's told him about her health problems and doesn't want to finish her off with this new worry. He comes up with a plan for Seward to visit them for lunch to avoid alarming Mrs. Westenra and then for him to examine Lucy and discuss his findings with Arthur afterwards. But Arthur gets called away to see his own father who has become ill again. Seward, of course, agrees and visits Lucy and her mother for lunch as planned. He speaks to Lucy alone afterwards and takes a few samples of her blood when she accidentally cuts herself. He tells Arthur that he doesn't think she has any specific illness but agrees with Arthur that she doesn't look well and that she seems to be anemic but without other expected signs of anemia. He concludes that the reason for her bloodlessness must be mental because of course he does. Like, of course she mentally willed all her blood away. Anyway, he tells Arthur he's written to his old friend and teacher, Dr. Van Helsing from Amsterdam, and that he'll be meeting Lucy again the next day to do further examination. Van Helsing agrees and comes to see Seward and Lucy the same day as Seward wants to save Van Helsing's life. Now, I'm not 100% sure what the book is getting at, but I think Seward sucked out some, quote, poison when Van Helsing got cut by a knife from another student when they were doing an operation to remove gangrene or something, or at least that's what I'm assuming went down. Anyway, Van Helsing examines Lucy and tells Seward that there's actually something very serious going on and it's a matter of life or death. He doesn't elaborate further and tells him he's going back to Amsterdam and will return in 3 days. Seward relates all of their meeting back to Arthur and reassures him to focus on his father and not worry too much about Lucy, as he'll send Arthur word if there's anything he needs to be concerned about. For the next few days, Seward continues to visit Lucy and also continues his work at the asylum. He notes Renfield periodically has violent outbursts and keeps flip-flopping between wanting to catch and eat flies and not being interested in them at all. He has one particularly violent outburst which happened to coincide with Lucy seemingly getting much better the next day and the day after that. Unfortunately, Lucy's condition takes a dramatic turn for the worse on the 3rd day, and I like how this bit is framed in the narrative as a few short telegrams from Seward to Van Helsing, keeping him updated. It's all very dramatic. Anyway, Seward sends a letter to Arthur to update him, but doesn't give him any specifics until Lucy has been seen by Van Helsing. He tells Arthur that Mrs. Westenra Westendra has consulted him professionally about Lucy because she's worried, and so Seward took advantage by mentioning Van Helsing was visiting him and that they'd both look after her. This gives them an excuse to come and go from the house to treat Lucy without sending Mrs. Westenra into cardiac arrest, and Seward firmly decides that she will not be involved in any of Lucy's care unless absolutely required. After Van Helsing returns from Amsterdam, Mrs. Westenra shows him and Seward up to Lucy's room before leaving them to it. The two men are horrified when they see Lucy as she's on death's door. She can barely breathe or move and her skin is like chalk. They quickly go back outside again, and Van Helsing tells Seward that Lucy needs a blood transfusion at once and there isn't a moment to lose. Seward volunteers to be the donor and they start to get ready when Arthur steps through the front door as he was too anxious about Lucy to stay away. Van Helsing takes one look at his, to quote Seward directly, stalwart proportions and strong young manhood, and decides he's going to be the one to give blood to Lucy. Van Helsing also finds a bit of humour when Arthur says he'd give every last drop of blood in his body for Lucy before he even knows what they want from him. They go back up to Lucy's room and Arthur waits outside whilst Seward and Van Helsing give Lucy a sedative to make her fall asleep for the operation, as they call it. And they literally don't tell her what it is or that they'll be doing a blood transfusion on her. Like, the atrocious medical ethics in this book is so stressful. I know it's a product of the time and women's opinions didn't really matter, but still, where is the patient consent? I do find it quite funny though how they straight up give her an opiate for a blood transfusion. Anyway, Seward is concerned with how long it takes for the drug to send her to sleep, as it means she must be extremely weak, but eventually Lucy nods off. They get Arthur back in and Van Helsing says he can kiss Lucy once whilst they get the equipment ready. Now, I'm gonna go off on a little historical medicine tangent here, because Van Helsing talks about not needing to defibrinate Arthur's blood, which I thought was interesting because fibrinogen is a clotting agent and nowadays they often keep clotting agents in blood transfusions. So I did some research and I think it's because ABO blood groups weren't officially discovered until 1901, which is 4 years after this book was published, and before that they'd often get disastrous transfusion reactions because of blood group incompatibility. So obviously they wouldn't have known the cause at the time, so I'm thinking that maybe they defibrinated blood because they thought it would reduce the likelihood of a reaction. I don't know, I'm not really a medical historian, I just thought it was interesting, but back to the story. Seward notes that some colour is coming back into Lucy's cheeks, but even then she's only partially restored in comparison to Arthur, who's become a lot weaker. Again, he notes how much strain Lucy's system must have been under in that case. After a while, Van Helsing finally decides they've transfused enough, and since Arthur's been a good boy, he can have another kiss. Which is kind of funny, but also, could it not have waited until Lucy woke up? Like, I'm sure she would also want to kiss her fiancé. Van Helsing sends Arthur home to rest, and whilst he's adjusting Lucy's pillow, a velvet ribbon that she normally wears around her neck gets dragged up. Van Helsing notices a red mark on her throat which alarms him, and Seward asks him about it once Arthur's gone. Van Helsing responds like a typical professor and throws the question right back at him. On closer inspection, Seward sees that she has 2 puncture marks on her neck and initially thinks this is the cause for her blood loss before dismissing it, because if she was bleeding from there, then the volume of blood she'd have to lose would cover the entire bed. Van Helsing gets up and tells him he has to go back to Amsterdam to get some books and things, and orders Seward to stay with Lucy all night and keep awake to watch over her. He waves off Seward's questions and says he'll be back soon, warning him again not to fall asleep. Seward stays with Lucy and updates Mrs. Westenra about Van Helsing's instructions. Mrs. Westenra tries to dismiss it, saying, "Lucy is much better now," and I'm like, lady, she's only better because of the doctors. Just do what they say. Seward is firm, and once Lucy is ready for bed, he takes a seat by the bedside next to her, which she is very grateful for. He eventually notices that Lucy seems to start drifting off and then shakes herself awake, so he asks her directly why she seems not to want to sleep. Lucy tells him that she's too scared to sleep. She doesn't know why, but she feels like this weakness comes over her and she has bad dreams that terrify her, but she can't remember what they are afterwards. Seward reassures her and promises to wake her up if he sees any signs of bad dreams, and Lucy gratefully thanks him and drifts off to sleep. Seward notes that she seems to be sleeping peacefully with a smile on her face, and in the morning leaves her with her maid and goes back to the asylum to take care of work that's been piling up. Seward gets another telegram from Van Helsing the next day, asking him to stay overnight again at Lucy's house, where he'll meet Seward directly. When Seward arrives, Lucy looks much better, and she takes one look at him and firmly insists that he will not be staying up tonight. She shows him to the room next to hers and leaves both their doors open, promising to call for him if she needs help, but otherwise he should get some sleep. Seward tiredly agrees and thanks her before conking out. Lucy goes back to her room and writes in her diary about how much better she feels and how grateful she is to everyone. She feels especially close to Arthur for some reason, but attributes it to her health coming back, making it easier for her to think about how much she loves him, because obviously, you know, why would these bloody doctors bother telling her that they did an operation on her, you know? Why would they bother informing the patient? Anyway, tonight Lucy feels like she won't be afraid to sleep because she feels close to Arthur and Seward is also nearby. And I just want to say, I feel so bad for Lucy. Like, she's this super sweet 19-year-old going through horrors and she has absolutely no idea what's going on or what's happening to her. Like, she's just so cute, and I will forever hate adaptations of Dracula that demonize her. Like, she's a victim, and this is why I liked 2024 Nosferatu, because the two main female characters both had bits of Lucy's character and neither of them were demonized or pitted against each other. So justice for my girl as well. Seward is gently woken up the next morning by Van Helsing, who asks how Lucy is doing. Seward says she's been doing much better, and the two of them go to her room to see her. The room is dark when they enter, so Seward opens the blind whilst Van Helsing tiptoes over to Lucy to avoid waking her. When the light comes into the room, Seward hears Van Helsing gasp in horror. On the bed, Lucy is sprawled. Her lips are white and her gums seem to have shrunk back from her teeth like a corpse. Seward rushes downstairs to get some brandy, which they rub on her lips and hands. Van Helsing is able to faintly detect a heartbeat, so jumps into action, telling Seward they have to do another transfusion. As Arthur will still be weak from the previous day and is also too far away, this time it'll have to be Seward. Seward has already rolled up his sleeves for it, and so the transfusion operation begins right away. Midway through, Van Helsing gets concerned Lucy might wake up, so decides to dose her with morphine again. Seward watches the colour come back slightly into Lucy's cheeks and feels a sense of pride in being able to save the woman he loves. They stop earlier than with Arthur, as Van Helsing needs Seward to be strong for the work they have to do. Seward recovers whilst Van Helsing attends to Lucy, and Van Helsing warns him not to tell Arthur in case it worries him or makes him jealous. He leaves to send a telegram telling Seward he's in charge and to not leave Lucy alone for a second until he gets back. Seward sits again by Lucy's bedside and wonders what could have caused such a sudden deterioration when she was getting so much better. His thoughts keep drifting to the wound on her neck, but he shakes them off as she wakes up. Mrs. Westenra comes in to check on them and notices Seward is looking worn out, so she tells him he needs to get a wife who can look after him. This embarrasses Lucy, but Seward doesn't say anything, which makes her feel relieved. Honestly, as much as I have beef with Seward, I do appreciate that even though he was rejected by Lucy, he's not spiteful about it. Like, he only wants her to be happy, even though it's not with him, and I think that's a very nice quality to have. I guess I don't really think he's a bad guy, but low-key, I would still fight this man. His crimes are too numerous. When Van Helsing gets back, he sends Seward home to rest and says he'll be staying tonight to watch over Lucy. When Seward returns after getting a good night's rest, he finds Lucy is also much better and Van Helsing is in a great mood. A parcel with a bunch of flowers has arrived and he gives them to Lucy, informing her it's medicine. This worries her until he reassures her that she doesn't have to eat them and only hang them around the room and around her neck to help her sleep. Lucy sniffs the flowers and laughs, thinking he's playing a joke on her as they're garlic flowers. To Seward's surprise, Van Helsing sternly tells her off and says he's being deadly serious. This frightens Lucy, so more gently Van Helsing reassures her that the flowers are for her own good. He asks her not to tell other people to avoid questions, and honestly, this will continue to be a recurring theme in the book where people just don't tell other people important stuff and then suffer the very avoidable consequences. Seward curiously watches Van Helsing rub garlic flowers all over Lucy's room before hanging them up and leaving the entire room smelling like garlic. He remarks that it seems like Van Helsing is casting a spell to ward off evil spirits, to which Van Helsing just responds vaguely. Van Helsing hangs the final wreath of flowers around Lucy's neck after she's gotten ready for bed and tells her not to move any of the flowers or open the windows or door. Lucy promises and gratefully thanks them both as they head out. As the men drive off in Seward's carriage, Van Helsing tells Seward that tomorrow they'll come again to check on Lucy, but tonight he'll finally be able to sleep in peace. Meanwhile, Lucy updates her diary about how much she likes Dr. Van Helsing, and even though he scared her with how strict he was about the flowers, she thinks he's right as she already feels safer with them and doesn't dread being alone tonight. Even the flapping sounds outside her window don't bother her. She thinks she'll end up sleeping like Ophelia, and there is some literary analysis foreshadowing parallels to be made here, but this is not a literary analysis video. I wonder what happened to Ophelia. But honestly, again, I feel so bad for Lucy. And okay, so I know I said no literary analysis, but she ends up mentioning something called virgin krantz, and I wanted to know what they were, so I looked it up, and apparently they're crown-shaped funeral garlands, usually used during the funerals of female virgins, and the foreshadowing. I feel like if I was a Victorian reading this, the connection would have been even more obvious. The absolute dread I would feel. But yeah, I just love it when I'm reading a book and little references pop up and become even more obvious on a second read through. Seward and Van Helsing meet at his hotel the next day, and the two of them set off together to check on Lucy. In the entrance hall, they meet Mrs. Westenra, who warmly tells them that Lucy is much better and that she's still asleep, as she checked on Lucy a little bit earlier. Van Helsing starts rubbing his hands together like a little goblin and exclaims that he's very glad that he's figured out what's going on and that his treatment is working. Mrs. Westenra tells him he can't take all the credit for himself, as Lucy's condition this morning is in part because of her. Confused, Van Helsing asks her what she's talking about, and she tells him that last night she was very anxious about Lucy, so she went to check on her. She found Lucy's room was very stuffy and full of flowers that had a strong odour, so she threw them all out and opened the window to let in some fresh air, because she was worried the smell would make Lucy unwell. She tells them they'll definitely be pleased when they see Lucy, thanks to her intervention, and walks off. Van Helsing manages to maintain his composure to avoid startling Mrs. Westenra, but as soon as she's out of sight, he has a total breakdown. And frankly, I agree with him. This bit is the most frustrating part of the entire book, because lady, what were you thinking? Why are you interfering with the doctor's treatment? Like, surely, if you knew that they were there to take care of her and found her room covered in flowers and knew they weren't from you, could you not have assumed that it was part of her treatment? Like, where else would they have come from? What else would they be for? What is wrong with you? It's so frustrating. Of course, not to entirely victim blame, because also it is Van Helsing's fault for not telling Mrs. Westenra about the flowers. Like, he could have told her they were medicine and should be left alone. It is common sense. Idiots. Sorry, I will never not lose my mind at this bit because it makes me rage with how frustrating it is. Anyway, Van Helsing starts crying, asking God what they or Lucy did to deserve this, but still says to himself that they can't tell Mrs. Westenra in case it kills her. And again, I'm like, no, telling her not to touch some flowers because their medicine isn't going to send her into cardiac arrest. You don't even have to tell her you think it's vampires. Just say the smell is good for Lucy or something. She's just a random lady. She's not going to question what the doctor says, especially not in the Victorian ages. As mentioned previously, this will be a recurring theme in this book. Anyway, Van Helsing pulls himself together and both he and Seward go up to Lucy's room to assess the damage. Lucy is once again back on death's door and Van Helsing is unsurprised this time. He locks the door to the room and immediately starts getting the equipment ready for another transfusion operation. Seward starts to take off his coat, ready to be the donor again, but Van Helsing stops him and says that this time he will be the donor as Seward is already weak. Like before, they complete the transfusion and Lucy's colour comes back. This time, Van Helsing decides he will watch over Lucy directly for the next 2 nights. He also goes down to tell Mrs. Westenra never to remove anything from Lucy's room again without his permission, and that the flowers are medicinal. Like I was saying, man, I gotta move on from this, otherwise I'm gonna get angry again. But he should have done this from the beginning. He should have done this from the start. Anyway, Seward watches all this go down and just wonders what all of it means and whether spending all his time in the asylum is making him go insane. For the next few days, Van Helsing watches over Lucy while she sleeps and she starts to get better. She writes in her diary about how she feels like she's coming out of a long nightmare and is feeling peace again. She's no longer afraid of bad dreams and feels like the commanding voices she's been hearing have stopped. Even the angry flapping at her window doesn't scare her anymore. She gets a new box of garlic to wear every day and she's grown quite fond of the smell. Van Helsing is going away for a day to Amsterdam that evening, but luckily at this point she's well enough not to need to be watched and is very glad about this because she doesn't want to trouble her loved ones any more than she already has. In fact, last night she woke up twice and caught Van Helsing sleeping in his chair, so she left him to get some rest and didn't even feel scared to go back to sleep. She's so cute. Now, the narrative switches from character diaries to a news article interviewing the local zookeeper. It describes an incident that happened the night Van Helsing goes to Amsterdam. Essentially, a giant wolf at the zoological gardens escaped, which puzzles the zookeeper because the wolf is normally very well behaved. He tells the interviewer that during feeding time last night, he heard a disturbance and went over to investigate. There was a tall thin man by the wolf cages who had red eyes and a pointy beard with a few white hairs running through it. He didn't like the look of the man, his teeth were too sharp when he smiled, and he pointed out the wolves were agitated. The zookeeper stroked one of the wolves, called Berserker, which seemed to calm him down, and to his surprise, the stranger also came and stroked Berserker's head too. When questioned, the stranger told the zookeeper he'd had several pet wolves before, then just walked off. That night, once the moon was out, all the wolves started howling on and off. When the zookeeper went to check on the wolves, he found that the bars to Berserker's cage were broken and he was gone. The reporter asks the zookeeper to speculate what he thinks happened to the wolf, and as the zookeeper is talking, he literally spots Berserker trotting back into the zoo. When he opens the door, floor, Berserker is back to his usual good behaviour, and the zookeeper notes that he's been cut up with a bunch of glass in his head. The zookeeper puts Berserker back in his cage with a nice steak, and the reporter concludes his story with relief that the wolf is no longer loose on the streets. Now, currently this bit doesn't seem that relevant to the story, but it will be very soon. Returning to Seward on the same evening the wolf escaped, he's back in his asylum, catching up on all the work that's piled up whilst he's been busy with Lucy. All of a sudden, the door to his study bursts open and Renfield rushes in, brandishing a dinner knife. For a second, Seward is astounded that Renfield even managed to break into his study to begin with. Then he dives out the way as Renfield lunges at him with the knife. He unfortunately isn't quite fast enough, and Renfield cuts his wrist quite deep, causing Seward's blood to pool on the floor. When Renfield makes a second attempt, however, Seward manages to get out of the way, sending Renfield sprawling on the ground. As Seward puts some distance between him and Renfield, the rest of the attendants finally rush in, and they all realise with disgust that Renfield is actually licking up the blood from Seward's wrist like a dog. They secure him, and he happily gets taken away whilst repeating the phrase, "The blood is the life." Seward is unhappy about losing more blood, given that he doesn't have much of that at the moment, and is glad Van Helsing hasn't summoned him because he can use the time to rest. This is then followed by a telegram from Van Helsing summoning Seward, and is one of the many reasons why I will maintain that Dracula is, amongst other things, a comedy masterpiece. Unfortunately, it turned out that the telegram had been delivered to the wrong address and was actually from the previous day. Van Helsing had asked Seward to watch over Lucy on the night he was going away, and Seward realises with horror that a whole night has been lost. He rushes over to Lucy's place to check on her, but by then it's already the next morning. Going back to the previous evening with Lucy, she writes a memorandum for people to find the next day, as she feels like she's dying and isn't sure she's going to survive the night. That evening, she got ready for bed as usual with the flowers from Van Helsing. She was woken up in the night by the flapping sounds again, and she notes they started after the first sleepwalking incident in Whitby with Mina. She felt too scared to go back to sleep or be alone, but didn't want to wake up her mother, so she opened the door to call out for someone, just in case Dr. Seward was around like Van Helsing had said he would be. When she didn't get any response, she decided to stay awake, but saw a big bat flapping outside the window, so got back into bed. Mrs. Westenra ended up coming in to check on her as she heard Lucy moving around, and Lucy asked her to sleep with her as she was scared. Mrs. Westenra agreed, but only for a little while, and got into bed, getting startled by the flapping sounds outside. Lucy reassured her, and everything was alright for a while, when suddenly they heard howling and a massive crashing noise. All the glass of Lucy's bedroom window was shattered over the floor, and when they looked over they saw the head of a massive grey wolf in the hole where her window had been. Mrs. Westenra jumped up in fear and started clutching wildly at things, accidentally tearing off Lucy's necklace of flowers. There was a gurgling sound, and then she fell over and knocked her head on Lucy's, making Lucy dizzy. Lucy watched the wolf draw its head back from the window, and a column of dust came towards her through the window. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to move as her mother's body was weighing her down, and she felt like she was under some kind of spell, so she fainted. When she came to, she was able to call out to the maids who were woken by the noise, and they were able to get Mrs. Westenra's body off Lucy. She told the maids to all have some wine as they were very frightened, and the door to her room slammed open and shut, scaring them all again. The maids went down as Lucy asked, and in the meantime, Lucy laid her remaining flowers on her mother, even though Van Helsing told her to keep them nearby. Basically, she figured that the servants were up now and would be able to sit with her. And again, if Van Helsing had been more honest, she probably would have been more likely to take the importance of the flowers seriously. Unfortunately, the maids didn't come back, even when Lucy called for them. When she went down to check, she found them all fainted on the floor and realised the wine they had all drank was drugged with Mrs. Westenra's laudanum. Lucy went back to sit with her mother's body and was too terrified to leave, as she could hear the wolf outside, and the air was full of specks of the same dust. She says her goodbyes in the memorandum as she thinks she's going to die like her mother, and honestly, I just feel so bad for her. When Seward arrives at Lucy's house the next morning, he knocks and rings on the door multiple times but gets no response. Initially, he curses at the servants for being lazy, as it's already mid-morning, but soon becomes worried when there's still no answer. Going around the house to try and find a way in, he sees all the windows and doors are locked, so returns to the front of the house when he hears horses approaching. Van Helsing arrives and laments that they might already be too late once Seward explains the situation about the telegram. He tells Seward that they're just going to have to break in, and they go around the back and saw the bars off the kitchen window. They find no one in the kitchen or servants' rooms, but when they get to the dining room, they find 4 maids on the floor and smell the laudanum from the wine. Van Helsing tells Seward to leave the maids as they need to check on Lucy first, and they rush up to her room. Outside, they can't hear a single sound, so they shakily push the door open. Inside, Lucy and her mother are both lying on the bed. Mrs. Westenra is covered in a white sheet, but the edge has blown back, showing a look of terror on her face, and they both know she's dead. Lucy, meanwhile, is lying pale and unmoving, and they can see 2 mangled white marks on her neck as the flowers are gone. Van Helsing bends over her chest to listen to her heart, and jumps up, crying to Seward that they still have time. Seward rushes back downstairs, grabs a brandy, this time smelling and tasting it to make sure it's not drugged as well, and sees the maids starting to come round but doesn't wait to check. Van Helsing rubs the brandy on Lucy's lips, gums and hands again, and tells Seward to get the maids to run a bath for Lucy, as she's almost cold as Mrs. Westenra's corpse and needs to be warmed up. Seward goes back down and easily manages to get 3 of the maids up, but the 4th is younger and was more affected, so he carries her to the sofa and lets her sleep. The maids are all quite dazed and start crying when they remember what happened, but Seward tells them off and says they don't have time to waste as Lucy's life is in danger. The maids get the bath ready and Lucy is carried in as is. They all start rubbing her limbs to try and warm her up, but they're interrupted by a knock on the door. One of the maids goes to answer and comes back saying there's a man with a message from Arthur, but Seward tells her to inform the man that he has to wait because they can't see anyone at the moment, and then forgets about him as he's too busy with Lucy. After a little while, Lucy's heart starts to beat a tiny bit stronger and they hear her breathing a little louder. Triumphantly, they get her out of the bath again and wrap her in a hot sheet before placing her back on her bed and giving her a bit more brandy. Unfortunately, she's still unconscious and looking worse than ever, so Van Helsing calls in one of the maids and tells her not to take her eyes off Lucy whilst the doctors work out what to do next. They go into the dining room, which is dimly lit according to death etiquette since Mrs. Westenra has just passed away. After a long silence, Van Helsing asks Seward what they're going to do. They need to do another transfusion soon or Lucy won't make it, but he and Seward are both too exhausted and he doesn't trust the women in the house. The period accurate misogyny in this book, I swear, it's just going to get so much worse. Anyway, a voice pipes up from the darkness and they realise Quincy Morris was in the room with them this whole time. Turns out he was the messenger from Arthur, and Arthur sent him because he was too worried about Lucy, especially since Seward hadn't updated him in a while, but Arthur wasn't able to come himself as his own father was getting worse as well. Van Helsing is initially angry at the interruption, but is relieved when he sees Seward's reaction, and Quincy volunteers to be the blood donor. They do the transfusion operation again, and at this point, I'm just going to assume that Lucy has an AB positive blood type because she didn't have a transfusion reaction once, and I find it really hard to believe that 4 different non-related men all had the same compatible blood type. I also don't think they ever told Lucy about any of these transfusions, which I mean is unsurprising but still not great. They just give her another dose of morphine. Seward unfortunately notices that Lucy doesn't seem to be responding to the transfusion as well as before, even though they took a lot of Quincy's blood. Seward takes Quincy to recover, and when he gets back he sees Van Helsing reading a slip of paper that dropped from Lucy when they carried her into the bath. He gives it to Seward to read, who has no idea what it means and wonders if Lucy has gone mad. Van Helsing takes the note back and tells him not to worry about it for now, as he'll understand everything in good time. Seward then tells Van Helsing that they need to sort out Mrs. Westenra's death certificate to avoid an inquest, as he's worried that the stress of it would kill Lucy. Not to mention, they'd have to provide her memorandum, which she'd just written. They decide to write the cause of death as heart disease, as previously known, and Seward sorts it out without any major issue. When he gets back, he checks on Lucy, who is still asleep with Van Helsing watching over her, and goes back down to Quincy, who takes him aside and asks him what's going on. Even though Lucy also rejected him, he still loves her and is anxious about her well-being. And again, I really appreciate how he's not spiteful or resentful towards her. Quincy has already deduced that both Seward and Van Helsing have also done the transfusion and suspects Arthur was in on it too, and likely the first one. He remarks that when he saw Arthur a few days ago, Arthur looked very worn out, like the time one of Quincy's horses had been out all night and a bunch of vampire bats had fed on it, forcing him to put the horse down. Seward can see Quincy is extremely anxious about the woman he loves, but is hesitant to share too much information against Van Helsing's wishes, despite the fact that Quincy has pretty much guessed everything already. He just nods in agreement, and when Quincy asks how long the whole thing has been going on, he informs him it's been 10 days since everything has started. Quincy is shocked and wonders what could have taken all that blood out of Lucy, given that her body shouldn't have been able to hold all the blood from 4 strong men. Seward replies how he has no clue, and that's what they're trying to figure out. He says that from now on, they're going to be staying and watching Lucy around the clock, and Quincy informs him that they can count on him too. Lucy wakes up a little while later and feels for her memorandum, as Van Helsing had replaced it to avoid alarming her. She then notices Van Helsing and Seward and becomes relieved, but then realises where she is and begins to cry, remembering that her mother is dead. The 2 men comfort her and inform her that from now on there will be someone with her at all times. Later that day at dusk, Lucy dozes off and Seward watches curiously as she takes her memorandum out and tears it in half while she's still sleeping. Van Helsing takes the 2 pieces out of her hands, but Seward watches as she continues to mimic tearing the paper into tiny pieces and makes a motion like she's scattering all the fragments. Van Helsing is quite surprised but doesn't say anything. That night, Lucy sleeps badly, afraid to fall asleep again, even though both Van Helsing and Seward are watching over her. Seward can also hear Quincy patrolling round and round the house all night. When morning finally comes, Lucy is weaker still and barely able to move. The 2 doctors watch her throughout the day as she flips between sleeping and waking and notices she looks stronger when she's asleep and her gums are drawn back from her teeth, which look longer and sharper. But when she's awake, she looks softer and more normal, though is evidently dying. She asks for Arthur and they send him a telegram with Quincy going off to fetch him from the station. It's sunset by the time he finally arrives and he's too overcome with emotion to say anything. Arthur's presence seems to rally Lucy a little, but she continues to drift in and out of little comas which are becoming longer. Seward will be relieving Arthur and Van Helsing's watch soon, but believes the watching won't last much longer as he doesn't think Lucy will survive to the next day because the shocks to her system have been too great. The narrative now switches back in time a few days to Mina, who has written to Lucy because she hasn't heard from her in a while. And can I just say, the letters have a little addendum to say they were never opened by Lucy, which is so sad. Mina apologises for not having written in so long and tells Lucy that she and Jonathan arrived back from Budapest to Exeter probably around 1 or 2 weeks ago and were met by Mr. Hawkins. They had dinner at his house and found out that he wanted them both to live with him. Also, as he's watched them both grow up and has no wife or children of his own, he has left everything in his will to them, including his business. This is really good news for the couple as neither of them really have any money, so they now have some financial stability and a permanent residence. The three of them are nicely settled in, and Mina asks after Mrs. Westenra and also about Lucy's wedding preparations. She wishes she could come up to London to visit Lucy for a day or two, but Jonathan is still quite weak and she needs to look after him, so she can't get away at the moment. She writes again the very next day in another unopened letter telling Lucy that unfortunately Mr. Hawkins suddenly passed away. Mina and Jonathan are both devastated as both of them are orphans, and so Mr. Hawkins was the only father figure in both of their lives. Jonathan is also under extra pressure because he feels nervous about the amount of responsibility he now has with the business. Mina's struggling to keep up a brave face to support him and so is writing to Lucy as she doesn't have anyone else she can talk to. Both of them will be coming up to London in a few days as Mr. Hawkins put down in his will that he wanted to be buried with his father, and Jonathan will have to be the chief mourner at the funeral because Mr. Hawkins doesn't have any nearer relations. She says she's going to try and drop by to see Lucy though, even if it's just for a few minutes. Meanwhile, Seward also receives a telegram from one of the other doctors at the asylum who he left in charge whilst he was away. Renfield escaped again, but luckily was caught before anyone was harmed. Apparently some delivery men going to the house next door were lost, so stopped by the asylum to ask for directions. Renfield taunted one of the men whilst he was knocking on the front door, but when the other doctor went down later to check on Renfield, he found that he was all settled again. Turns out this was just Renfield being sneaky because within 30 minutes he was off out the window and down the lane. The doctor called for some attendants and ran after him and saw him grab one of the delivery men out of their cart, which had a bunch of massive boxes being taken away from the house, and then start bashing the man's head against the ground. Luckily, the doctor was able to grab Renfield before he ended the man, and the other worker from the cart also grabbed Renfield to try and subdue him. Even then, with the three men holding him, Renfield was very hard to pin down and started yelling about fighting for his lord and master once the attendants arrived and put him in a straitjacket. The attendants managed to drag Renfield off to his padded cell, with one of them breaking a finger in the process, and the doctor smoothed things over with the delivery men by paying them off and giving them some alcohol. He took down their names and addresses in case they were needed in future, and found out they were both working for a shipping company. Hint, it was the same one as in Dracula's letters way back from the beginning of the book. Back in Lucy's house, Seward goes to relieve Van Helsing and Arthur. At first, Arthur refuses to leave Lucy's side, but they manage to convince him by saying he needs to keep up his strength to avoid causing Lucy more suffering. He's already extremely worn out because he's received news that his father has died. Poor man. There is clearly something in the air making all of these people drop. It's vampires. Van Helsing's inner dad activates and he takes Arthur off to sleep on the sofa while Seward stays with Lucy. He notes how her teeth seem sharper than before, especially the canines, but is distracted by a large bat that's periodically striking the window with its wings. When he gets back to Lucy, he sees she's moved and ripped the garlic flowers away from her neck, so Seward replaces them as best he can. Lucy continues to wake up then fall back asleep, and Seward thinks it's odd how when she's awake she clutches at the flowers and when she's asleep she pushes them away from herself. In the morning, Van Helsing comes back up to relieve Seward, but leaves Arthur downstairs to continue to get some rest. He's concerned by Lucy's appearance and asks Seward to raise the blinds to let in some light. Van Helsing lifts away the flowers and silk handkerchief covering Lucy's neck and jumps back in surprise, causing Seward to come over. He feels a chill when he realises the wounds on Lucy's neck are completely gone. After several moments of silence, Van Helsing tells Seward it won't be long now before Lucy dies and to go and fetch Arthur. Arthur is dazed when Seward wakes him up but is overcome with grief when Seward tells him Lucy's time is almost up. When they go up, they see Van Helsing has tidied things up and brushed Lucy's hair. Arthur bends down to kiss Lucy when she greets him, but Van Helsing stops him and tells him to take her hand instead. Soon, Lucy falls back asleep and the changes Seward previously noticed happen again. In an almost unconscious way, her eyes flutter open and she asks Arthur to kiss her. Seward recoils at the sound of her voice as she's speaking in a voluptuous way he's never heard before. And I'm just like, let a girl be voluptuous, okay? But obviously, you know, Victorian ideals about women and purity, blah blah blah. Arthur doesn't seem to notice the difference and goes to kiss Lucy, but Van Helsing grabs him with both hands by the neck and with the strength of 1,000 suns flings him back, saying, "Not for your life." then blocks his access to Lucy. Arthur is so stunned he can't even act, but both Seward and Van Helsing are watching Lucy and see a brief flicker of rage across her face. Then her eyes close again and she seems to wake up properly this time, looking soft like normal. She takes Van Helsing's hand and kisses it, weakly thanking him for everything he's done, and asks him to look after Arthur. Van Helsing kneels down beside her and solemnly promises to do so, then brings Arthur closer and tells him to take her hand and kiss her once on the forehead. He then pulls Arthur back and they all watch until slowly her breathing stops. Van Helsing declares it's all over and Seward takes Arthur away to the drawing room where he breaks down. When Seward goes back up to Lucy's room, he notices that some change has come over her and she seems to have recovered some of her beauty. He sadly tells Van Helsing that at least she's at peace now that everything's over, and Van Helsing solemnly tells him it's only the beginning, then refuses to elaborate further. Heartbroken, Seward goes off to take a moment to update his diary and feels that he can only do so because of habit. In fact, if death came flapping its wings to take him away as well, he wouldn't care. The next day, Seward takes care of funeral preparations for Lucy and Mrs. Westenra so they can both be buried together, as Arthur is already busy arranging his own father's funeral. Lucy and Mrs. Westenra don't really have any other close relatives, so Van Helsing and Seward go through all the papers to send to Mrs. Westenra's solicitor. Seward worries Van Helsing won't understand English law and so might accidentally miss stuff, but it turns out that not only is Van Helsing a doctor, but he's also a lawyer. Like, where did this man get all the time for this? Anyway, he tells Seward that he wants to do some more digging for Lucy's personal letters, like the memorandum, using the excuse that he doesn't think her thoughts should go into the hands of strangers, and also because he wants more information about Dracula. He finds Lucy's diary and a few unopened letters and intends to look through them once he's spoken to Arthur and gotten his permission for it. Before they leave, Seward and Van Helsing lift up the sheet covering Lucy and are both surprised by how beautiful she still looks. In fact, Seward can hardly believe she's actually dead. Van Helsing sternly tells Seward to wait with her for a few minutes, then returns with a bunch more wild garlic flowers that he places around the bed and puts a golden crucifix over Lucy's mouth. He later finds Seward getting ready for bed and tells him to bring some post-mortem knives with him tomorrow. When Seward questions about whether he wants to make an autopsy, Van Helsing straight up tells him that he wants to cut off Lucy's head and take out her heart. Seward is understandably shocked about why poor Lucy's corpse has to be mutilated, but Van Helsing waves off his questions and simply tells him to trust me, bro. Well, I'm paraphrasing of course. He assures Seward he's doing this for Lucy's own good and asks him to have faith in him like he has before. Van Helsing says he would have done it tonight, but Arthur will want to see Lucy once he gets back from his father's funeral and he doesn't want anyone else to know what they're doing / give poor Arthur additional trauma. Seward, though still shocked, promises to trust him. And honestly guys, I think everyone deserves a friend who will help them mutilate a corpse, no questions asked. As Seward watches Van Helsing go back to his own room, he spots a maid going into Lucy's bedroom and is touched by the devotion of the girl in staying by her mistress's side even after death. The next day, Seward gets woken up by Van Helsing and told not to bother with the post-mortem knives as it's either too late or too early. Seward once again has no idea what he's talking about, and Van Helsing shows him the little gold crucifix that he put on Lucy's mouth the day before. Turns out it got stolen during the night, and Van Helsing recovered it from the worthless wretch who robs the dead. And I just think it's so funny that Seward saw this secretive maid and immediately assumed she was going to sit up with Lucy all night when she was only actually going in to rob her. Van Helsing tells Seward they have to wait, then whisks himself away and leaves Seward even more puzzled than before. Seward spends a lot of this portion of the book just being confused. Later that afternoon, they meet Mrs. Westenra's solicitor, who informs them that since Mrs. Westenra was expecting to die any day now, she'd already put her affairs in order and left everything to Arthur as she'd been expecting Lucy to marry him. I would argue that this wasn't a particularly smart decision, as if Arthur had turned out to be a horrible man, Lucy would have still been forced to stay with him or be totally penniless. In fact, this even gets mentioned by the solicitor, who strongly tried to convince her not to do it. But I think it's already been well established that smart is not the word to describe Mrs. Westenra. Not to speak ill of the dead or anything, like I know she was a loving mother, but I'm still so salty about those garlic flowers. I genuinely believe Lucy could have survived if she'd had the extra day and one less occasion of being completely drained of her blood. I just don't understand why Lucy's biggest op is her own mother. Anyway, the solicitor goes on about how it actually turned out for the best and how glad he is about how things turned out, because now Arthur can inherit everything without being contested by Lucy and Mrs. Westenra's other relatives. Van Helsing and Seward are glad that it's Arthur who owns everything now, as it makes things easier for them, but are also kind of annoyed by this solicitor's poor choice of words. Arthur arrives a few hours later and Seward notes that he looks so broken that it's even affected his stalwart manhood. And I shouldn't laugh, but Seward mentions other men's manhood so often. He is so obsessed. Arthur seems to be on the verge of tears, so Seward Seward takes him upstairs to see Lucy alone. As Seward turns to go, Arthur grabs his arm and asks him to join him, saying he knows how Seward was in love with Lucy because she told him everything. He breaks down and tells Seward that he doesn't know how to thank him for everything he's done for Lucy, and that he doesn't know how to keep going on now that he's lost the two people in his life he loved the most. I would like to take a moment to appreciate Arthur here for being secure in his relationship with Lucy and for not being toxic or jealous to Lucy, Seward or Quincy. Like, it can't have been easy knowing both of your best friends were in love with your fiancé, but he never stopped being kind or loving towards any of them, and I just feel so bad for him, okay? Like, he and Lucy deserve to be happy together. Neither of them deserved it, and it's all really sad. Seward gives Arthur a manly hug and lets him get it all out, then gently takes him in to see Lucy. To both of their shocks, when they pull back the sheet, Lucy looks even more beautiful than the last time they saw her corpse. After a long silence, Arthur asks Seward if she actually is dead, and Seward assures him that she is. He rushes to make some excuses to Arthur, as Seward doesn't want Arthur's doubt about Lucy being dead to get worse, especially because accidentally burying someone alive was a fear people had during those times. They even made safety coffins with bells to prevent that sort of thing, but I'm not sure if they ever actually worked. Arthur seems reassured, though Seward himself doesn't really understand why Lucy hasn't started decomposing yet. Once Arthur has finished his goodbyes, Van Helsing asks the Undertaker's men to start making preparations to screw up the coffin. He, Seward, and Arthur then have dinner together, and Arthur also thanks Van Helsing for everything he's done for Lucy. He apologises to Van Helsing if he seemed rude that time Van Helsing stopped him from kissing Lucy, and asks Van Helsing not to call him Lord Godalming, which is the title he's now inherited from his father. Van Helsing warmly says he'll call him Arthur as he's come to love him, and Mr. is too formal. This is also something that happens a lot in the book, where people will meet each other for a day and declare their undying loyalty. It's like platonic insta-love. Van Helsing also tells Arthur that it's understandable if he was angry, but asks Arthur to trust him in the future when he asks for it, aka gently building up to asking to cut off Lucy's head. Arthur, at this point, not really knowing what Van Helsing is implying, warmly agrees, especially as he is/was both Seward and Lucy's friend. Van Helsing then takes the opportunity to slyly ask Arthur that since he now owns all of Mrs. Westenra's property, if he'd be able to read all of Lucy's letters/papers, and Arthur agrees. When Seward goes to bed that night, he can hear Van Helsing patrolling around, never going too far away from Lucy's room. We now return to Mina. She is finally updating her diary again, as the last entry was from when she was in Whitby. Basically, Jonathan had another attack whilst they were in London for Mr. Hawkins's funeral, and she wants it all to be noted down in case Jonathan ever asks about it in future. The funeral itself went well enough, though there weren't that many people there, and afterwards, the two of them went to Piccadilly to walk around because they felt lonely. Mina was watching a beautiful woman sitting outside a shop when all of a sudden, Jonathan cried out and gripped her arm so tight it hurt. When she looked at him, he looked like he'd seen a ghost, and she saw he was watching a tall, thin man with a beaky nose, black moustache and pointy teeth. The man was also watching the same pretty girl and was so absorbed in it that he didn't seem to notice that both of them were looking at him. Mina started to get worried and asked Jonathan if he was alright, but he just asked her if she realised who it was, telling her it's the man himself. He was acting like he barely knew it was Mina who he was speaking to. They watched as the pretty lady got into a carriage and drove off, and saw that the man also followed in the same direction before hailing a cab and following the lady as well. Jonathan was so terrified that he started whispering to himself, saying it was the Count, but he looked younger and how can this be, etc. Mina took him away, and the two of them sat in a park for a while, where Jonathan fell asleep on her shoulder. Mina didn't want to disturb him, and when he woke, he seemed to have entirely forgotten about the encounter and took her to get some tea as an apology. Mina feels concerned about his episodes, but is too afraid to ask him in case it makes him worse. She decides, however, that she needs to know what happened to him to help him, and plans to read his diary once they get back home. Once they get back to Exeter, Mina receives a telegram from a man called Van Helsing, who informs her of Lucy and Mrs. Westenra's death. She cries, overwhelmed with her worry for Jonathan and the loss of Mr. Hawkins, Lucy and Mrs. Westenra, as well as in pity for Arthur. Now, going back to Seward, the Westenra ladies have both been buried, and Arthur has gone back home, taking Quincy with him as support. Seward notes that Quincy probably suffered just as much over Lucy's death, but kept a brave face in order to support his friends. Van Helsing is going back to Amsterdam for a day before coming back, and Seward notes that he must have been really going through it, because he saw him struggling during the funeral when Arthur was talking about how he already felt married to Lucy, having given her his blood. No one actually told Arthur about the other transfusions, and the plan is that they never will. And let me tell you, when I say Van Helsing is an absolute menace, because when he and Seward finally get into the carriage after the funeral, he immediately starts laughing, then crying, then laughing again, then crying. Turns out he could barely hold it in when Arthur was talking about the transfusions, because by implication it would make Lucy a polyandrist for having taken blood from 4 different men, and Van Helsing a bigamist because he already has a wife. And a little tidbit of backstory here. Apparently, Van Helsing has a wife who went insane after the death of their son, but he refuses to divorce her because he's a devout Catholic. I had to check this part because he mentions how he has a poor wife who's alive but dead to him, and I thought it meant that he was divorced or something, but there's a part where he refers to her as having no wits, and I think that's supposed to mean that she's insane, though I originally thought it meant she was stupid and he hated her and that's why she was dead to him. Anyway, Seward is understandably not pleased with this, but then he goes and ruins it by saying he tried to be stern with Van Helsing because he's acting like a woman, and one needs to be stern with women in these types of situations. Seward, I swear to God, it's on site. If I see you, it's on site. I'm trying so hard to like this man. Like, it's not like he doesn't have any decent qualities, but then he just opens his mouth and ruins it. Okay, well, Van Helsing apologises to Seward, saying he couldn't help it because of the irony, and he wishes Seward could see how much he's grieving for Lucy and Arthur, especially since he has a soft spot for Arthur because he looks like how his son would have looked like if he'd lived. Seward accepts his apology and later updates his diary, sadly stating he doesn't know if he'll ever write another entry because he feels so hopeless and empty now. The narrative now shifts to a newspaper article from the Westminster Gazette. It describes how, over the last few days, there seems to be a new ghost in town, as several children have gone missing in the evenings and shown up later with some minor injuries on their necks, all of them saying they were hanging out with some sort of bloofer lady. The writer suspects the first child that went missing used the phrase bloofer lady, and it caught on with the rest of the kids, and is sceptical that this bloofer lady is as stunningly beautiful as these children seem to think she is. Bloofer here likely refers to just the children mispronouncing beautiful, I think. Police have advised that people keep a lookout for rats or dogs in the area, as they think some sort of animal is causing the wounds on the children. It's also incredibly funny to me how the article writer just keeps referring to these attacked children as it. A second article also writes about how another child went missing overnight, and it was found in a bush, very thin and weak, and it was also talking about the bloofer lady. Going back to Mina, she is super proud of Jonathan for how he's handling his new position as head of his and Mr. Hawkins's firm, and is glad that he seems to be so busy he doesn't have time to worry about the horrors. Since he'll be away late this evening, she's planning on sitting down and reading his journal to figure out what actually happened to him. Once she's finished the journal, she wonders how much of it is true, or whether Jonathan caught his so-called brain fever and then wrote down all the things that went down in Dracu's castle. Either way, she's devastated by how he must have suffered, but doesn't want to bring it up to Jonathan in case it sets him off again. She thinks about the man they saw yesterday and how Jonathan seemed so sure it was Count Dracula, but it could have also just as easily been Mr. Hawkins's funeral setting Jonathan off. She remembers how on their wedding day Jonathan talked about his solemn duty that might cause him to have to go back to the journal, and wonders what that might be. Mina decides she's going to typewrite out all of Jonathan's journal just in case other people might need to read it for some reason, as it's currently written in shorthand so only she and Jonathan can understand it. Either way, she's hoping she might be able to use it to find a way to comfort Jonathan. Mina then receives a telegram from the same Dr. Van Helsing who informed her of Lucy's death. He tells her that with Lord Godalming, aka Arthur's permission, he's read all of Lucy's letters and found some things in Mina's letters to Lucy that he wants to urgently discuss with her in person, but asks her at the moment not to tell her husband in case it distresses him. Mina replies, giving him an exact train time that he can use to come to Exeter on the same day, and excitedly waits for his visit. Mina also typewrites out her own journal from Whitby so she can give it to Van Helsing directly, in case he needs more information about Lucy's sleepwalking. She also starts to worry about whether she should have mentioned something to Mrs. Westenra, in case it might have saved Lucy, and can't bear the thought that she might have contributed to Lucy's death. When Van Helsing arrives, Mina greets him in her drawing room, and they do indeed start discussing Lucy's sleepwalking, though only after telling each other that any friend of Lucy's must be an excellent person, which is nice. Van Helsing then ruins it with the obligatory period-accurate misogyny comment about how young ladies don't really have good memories for facts or details, and Mina produces her journal for him to read. She plays a little prank on him by giving him the shorthand version, but then Mina ruins it by thinking about how she couldn't help herself and supposes it's due to the taste of the original apple that remains in women's mouths, like from Genesis. Mina, why are you saying this? Like, of course it was a man who wrote this book. Bram Stoker is giving Men Writing Women Victorian edition. These two, honestly, but I still really like them both. Anyway, Van Helsing jumps up and gives her a few compliments about the shorthand and asks for her help in reading it. Mina gives Van Helsing the typewritten copy, apologising, saying she suspected he would ask about Lucy and wrote this all up because she knows his time is precious, to which Van Helsing gets a bit misty-eyed and thanks her. He asks if he can read it now in case he needs to ask her anything later, and she says he can read it while she orders lunch and then ask her whatever he wants whilst they eat. Mina gives him some space to read her journal alone, and when she gets back, she finds him excitedly pacing around the room. He grabs her hands and starts gushing about how clever she is and how grateful he is for her help, with one of my favourite lines from the book: "I am dazed, I am dazzled." He tells her that he is her friend for life and it will be his absolute pleasure to do anything and everything he can for her and her loved ones if she ever needs it. Mina thinks he's giving her a bit too much credit, but he waves her off and asks her about Jonathan. Mina takes the opportunity to tell him about the encounter with the strange man in London, and then everything else comes out in a rush. She falls to her knees and begs Van Helsing to help Jonathan, and Van Helsing gently lifts her up and tells her that of course he'll do everything he can for Jonathan, but of course only after he tells her that she gives him hope that there are still good women around. Oof. He tells her that for now she needs to eat to keep up her strength, and that he's going to stay in Exeter tonight and come back the next day once he's had time to think about what he needs to ask. After lunch, Van Helsing asks Mina to tell him about Jonathan, and she hesitates at first, worried that he'll think Jonathan is mad if she tells him about what's in his journal. But he reassures her, and so she gives Van Helsing the typewritten copy of Jonathan's journal to take away with him. She impresses him with her knowledge of train timetables because she's memorised all the trains to and from Exeter in case it helps Jonathan with his work. Friends, get yourself a wife who memorises train timetables for you. Van Helsing goes back to his hotel and telegrams Mina later that evening, telling her everything in Jonathan's diary is true. He compliments Jonathan's bravery and reassures her that the type of man who is brave enough to go into Dracula's room on 2 separate occasions is not the type of man to be permanently driven mad by shock. He tells her that he is dazzled more than ever, and that he'll have many questions for Jonathan tomorrow. Van Helsing, they can never truly make me hate you. He is just too funny. This is why I think the Nosferatu adaptation of Van Helsing is the most book accurate. Like, I love Hugh Jackman's Van Helsing, but truly, he is just a guy. Specifically, this guy. And he really has no clue what he's doing, especially at the start. Mina responds and thanks Van Helsing for taking a weight off her mind, but is horrified at the thought of a real monster in London. Mina updates her journal, shocked about how everything Jonathan wrote is true, but can't decide if she should tell him. She wants to keep him from further harm, but also wonders if it might actually benefit him to know that he's not mad. She plans to discuss this with Van Helsing when he returns, to get his advice on what would be the best thing to do for Jonathan. Now, after many moons, we finally return to Jonathan's POV. Mina told him last night about Van Helsing's visit, and then literally everything else, including the telegram confirming that his journal was all true. Clearly, she decided she wasn't going to bother consulting Van Helsing. Comedy masterpiece Dracula strikes again. Jonathan feels like a new man and isn't afraid anymore, as it was the doubt about whether everything was real or not that was driving him mad. He wonders about how Dracula managed to make himself look younger and thinks Van Helsing is clearly the man to hunt him out. He goes over to the hotel in the morning to introduce himself and collect Van Helsing, which surprises him. Van Helsing scrutinises Jonathan's face, commenting how Mina had told him he was ill, and Jonathan smiles and says Van Helsing has cured him already by confirming everything in his diary. Van Helsing laughs and tells him how he's looking forward to breakfast with both of them, and showers Mina with compliments. Jonathan, being a wife guy, would happily listen to people complimenting Mina all day, and just lets Van Helsing go on for a while about how Mina was fashioned by God to show men and other women that heaven is real. And Jonathan is just like, yeah, it do be like that. Van Helsing takes Jonathan's hand and says, "Let us be friends for life," which goes back to the whole known you for a day, but would name my firstborn child after you thing that this book has going on. After breakfast, Jonathan takes Van Helsing back to the station, where Van Helsing asks if he can ask for both Jonathan and Mina's help in future if he ever sends for them in London, to which Jonathan readily agrees. He gets the morning paper, the Westminster Gazette, for Van Helsing to read on the train, and watches curiously as Van Helsing cries out about how it's too soon when his eyes fall on one of the articles. Van Helsing recovers himself and jumps on the train, telling Jonathan to give his love to Madame Mina and that he'll be in touch soon. Another POV shift, and we're back with Seward. First thing he does is make a comment about how there's no such thing as finality because it hasn't even been a week since his last diary entry. He records how Renfield has gone back to his usual fly and spider business, and also that both Arthur and Quincy seem to be doing much better. He himself feels like he is starting to recover from the loss of Lucy when Van Helsing comes bounding back into his study after returning from Exeter and chucks a newspaper at him. Seward is baffled once again, but Van Helsing points out the parts about the wounds on the children, and Seward notices the similarity to Lucy's case. Van Helsing is once again being vague, as he keeps trying to get Seward to come to his own conclusions, and also confirmed my belief that if Lucy had had one more day, she could have been saved. Mrs. Westenra, I'm looking looking at you. Eventually, he tells Seward about how there are bats which often feed on blood, and Seward jumps up, wondering if there's a bat like that in London and whether it fed off Lucy and now the other children. Van Helsing waves him off and keeps going on, this time talking about toads and shamans, and bewilders Seward so much that he begs Van Helsing to just treat him like a student again and give him a hint. He realises that Van Helsing is going on about all of these things because he wants Seward to have an open mind, after which Van Helsing tells him the marks on the children were made by Lucy. Seward is so stunned with anger that he can't even speak for a moment, then demands if Van Helsing has lost his mind. Van Helsing manages to calm him down and says he'll prove it to him. So the two go on to visit the child that was attacked by the Blue lady at the hospital. Side note, they also keep referring to the child as it, which is hilarious, and Seward admits that the wounds on the child's neck look very similar to Lucy's wounds. They ask the doctor in charge what his theories are, and he says he thinks it may have been due to a bat. After that, Van Helsing drags Seward off to break into Lucy's tomb, he doesn't know that part yet, and they spend the night at the cemetery. They go inside the West End tomb, and Van Helsing starts opening Lucy's coffin. Seward is horrified and tries to stop him, but Van Helsing tells him he's going to see. As the lid starts to come off, Seward is surprised that there's no gas coming out from a week-old corpse, and is shocked when they find the coffin is empty. Now, despite his shock, Seward is still not convinced that Lucy is walking around attacking children and suggests it was a body snatcher, which I think is fair enough. Seward himself probably ended up dissecting a few corpses at medical school that were unethically sourced. Not that the legally obtained bodies were that ethically sourced back then either. Van Helsing just sighs and tells him they'll just have to get more proof. They leave the tomb and Van Helsing locks the door and tries to give Seward the key for assurance, but Seward scoffs and says a key can have duplicates or the lock could be picked, so Van Helsing just puts it back in his pocket and tells Seward to watch one side of the graveyard whilst he watches the other. So Seward is just waiting for hours, having a miserable time, when he suddenly sees a white streak moving across the graveyard and another dark shadow where Van Helsing is. Seward goes to Van Helsing and finds him holding a sleeping child. The child doesn't have any puncture marks, but Seward still feels like this isn't proof, so they leave the child by the police station to be found in the morning and decide to go back the next day to check Lucy's tomb. Or more like, Van Helsing tells Seward that they will both be coming back. They hang around the graveyard until mid-afternoon the next day, waiting for the last funeral service to end, then sneak back into the West End tomb, this time during daylight hours. Seward laments how useless this whole thing is, given that the coffin is empty, and also how very illegal it all is. This time, however, when they lift the coffin lid, they find Lucy lying there like she's asleep, and even more beautiful than ever. Now, Seward is in total shock and asks Van Helsing if it's a prank. Van Helsing lifts up Lucy's red lips to reveal unnaturally pointy teeth which match the bites on the children. Seward is initially still in denial, saying maybe the grave robbers put her back last night, but then starts to come round to Van Helsing's idea that she's undead, especially because of how very obviously she doesn't look like a week-old corpse. He asks Van Helsing what he's going to do, and Van Helsing reaffirms the plan to cut off her head, fill her mouth with garlic, and stake her altogether. Seward shudders at the thought of mutilating the body of the woman he'd loved, but not as much as he'd thought, as he's already feeling uneasy at the thing that is now Lucy. Van Helsing decides that rather than staking her then and there, he wants to get Arthur to come along so Arthur can see what she's become and not always be wondering about why Van Helsing stopped him from kissing Lucy or worry that they killed her by burying her alive. Van Helsing wants to give Arthur some peace and spare him from being haunted by this whole thing due to his fondness for Arthur. Oh, and also Van Helsing decides they're going to bring Quincy along as well. So off they go, with Van Helsing saying he'll be watching over the tomb alone tonight, and after that the boy band will all get back together. Van Helsing later writes an undelivered telegram to Seward which informs him that he's going to put garlic and a crucifix over the West End tomb to keep Lucy from coming out, meaning she'll be hungrier the next day. He isn't particularly worried about Lucy, but is concerned in case Dracula might come and set a bunch of wolves on him, so he leaves instructions for Seward to read all of the enclosed papers, which also contain the Harker diaries, and to kill Dracula if he doesn't make it. Unfortunately, once Seward gets a good night's sleep, he decides that everything he saw the previous afternoon and everything Van Helsing told him was a load of rubbish, and goes back to not believing anything. In fact, he starts to wonder if Van Helsing set the whole thing up and has gone mad, so resolves to keep a close eye on him. The next day, the boy band, consisting of Van Helsing, Arthur, Quincy and Seward, all get together in Van Helsing's study. Arthur and Quincy are both at a loss as to why they've been summoned and would like an explanation, but Van Helsing first makes them both promise to remain calm and let him stand on business. Quincy agrees readily, leading to another platonic insta-love moment between him and Van Helsing, and it's just so funny to me how Bram Stoker always describes these moments like they're a momentous occasion. I'm really curious to know if Victorians really were going around acting like this, because I don't think they were. But yeah, Arthur is a bit less accepting and tells Van Helsing he can't make that kind of promise if it would affect his honour as a gentleman or faith as a Christian, and wants Van Helsing's assurance that it won't. Van Helsing agrees, then asks Arthur to come with him to the West End tomb and open Lucy's coffin. Arthur is understandably furious at the idea of desecrating Lucy's resting place, and then Van Helsing makes it worse by implying that if they don't, Lucy will be doomed to hell, and then straight up asks Arthur if he can cut off Lucy's head, and he does it so politely as well. He tries to tell Arthur that Lucy is undead, which Arthur takes to mean as she's been buried alive, and absolutely point blank refuses to let Van Helsing go anywhere near Lucy, as he takes his duty of protecting her grave very seriously. And I know I shouldn't laugh, but the entire conversation is such a train wreck. It is so funny. Van Helsing also gets up at this point and sternly tells Arthur that he is also doing his duty, and that for now all he wants is to help the people he loves, including Lucy. He finally tells Arthur that he also gave blood to save Lucy's life and would happily give his life if it can save her further, which calms Arthur down enough for him to agree to at least go with the group to the graveyard. So the boy band sneak into the graveyard after midnight and sneak back into the tomb. Van Helsing gets Seward to confirm to the whole group that Lucy's body was definitely in the coffin the day before, and Arthur notices that the coffin lid has already been opened slightly, which riles him up again. This all goes away when Van Helsing opens the lid and reveals to everyone's horror that the coffin is empty. For a while, no one speaks. Then Quincy apologetically asks Van Helsing to pinky promise that he isn't responsible for this. Van Helsing swears it and tells the two younger men about his and Seward's adventures the last 2 nights, which Seward confirms again. He tells the group to all come out, then decks out the entrance of the tomb with the communion bread, filling up the cracks like it's anti-vampire cork. The 3 others are a bit skeptical, especially when he tells them he's blocking the door to keep the undead from entering again, but they realise he's being serious when they find out he's committing a massive Catholic no-no by crushing up the sacred host, and that he even received special permission to do it. Van Helsing assigns them all watching spots, and they all wait. After a while, Van Helsing signals them all and points out a white figure in the distance carrying something dark. The moon shines through and reveals a woman holding a child, though they can't see the face because it's bent over the child. The 3 younger men go to move forward, but Van Helsing stops them, and when the woman lifts her head, they realise it's Lucy, but her features have all changed, and she's gone from looking sweet and pure to voluptuous and cruel. The men all advance on Van Helsing's signal, and they can see that Lucy's lips are covered in blood. She sees them all and snarls. Now, the vibes in this bit are kind of bad because Seward decides that her eyes are unclean and full of hellfire and thinks he could have happily killed her then and there. Like, I know she's a villain now, but the vibes? Rancid. She even gets compared to Medusa, which I think is pretty apt, and I would highly recommend looking up different interpretations of that story. Lucy, meanwhile, realises who they all are and just tosses the child away, now smiling at them all. She comes forward and sexily asks Arthur to come to her so they can be together, and Arthur, in a trance, starts to move forward. Van Helsing jumps into action and leaps between them, holding up his crucifix, which sends her recoiling back, and she dashes past him to try and get into her tomb. Unfortunately for her, once she gets within a few feet of the door, she's stopped by some invisible force. They hold in a standoff for a few moments, and Van Helsing once again asks Arthur's permission to cut off Lucy's head. This time, Arthur tearfully agrees, and Van Helsing moves forward and removes a few pieces of his anti-vampire cork on the tomb door. Lucy immediately turns into a gas or something and disappears through the cracks into the tomb, and Van Helsing replaces the anti-vampire cork to keep her there. Once he's finished, he picks up the child, telling the others they'll leave it for the police to find, and that they're going to come back tomorrow at 2 p.m. sharp to finish the job whilst Lucy is still asleep. The next day, everyone rocks up to the graveyard in black, ready for some vampire slaying. After milling around for a bit, the last funeral of the day is complete, and the boy band have the place to themselves again. They go back to the tomb and open Lucy's coffin, where she's once again lying asleep. Seward, at this point, hates the creature because of its carnal and unspiritual appearance, and even Arthur is repulsed. And I just feel like there is a lot to unpack here, but we're going to move on. Van Helsing gets his equipment ready and gives a speech to the other men about the law TM, about how once you get bitten by a vampire, you'll become one after you die, even if you only get bitten once, and even if you die of natural causes, which is why Van Helsing stopped Arthur from kissing Lucy. The only way to stop this is to kill said vampire responsible, and it's worth noting here that whilst the vibes are still bad, they are only doing this because they truly believe they're sparing Lucy hell and freeing the soul of the woman they all love, especially because once she actually kills someone, she'll be condemned forever. On top of this, killing her is the only way now to save the other children she's already bitten. Van Helsing also decides that Arthur will be the one to stake her and set her free. Arthur agrees to this, and with Van Helsing's help, uses the stake and hammer to pierce Lucy's heart. Lucy immediately wakes up and starts screaming, but Arthur continues to hammer as the other men read sacred texts. Finally, Lucy stops moving and the vault goes silent. Arthur drops the hammer and staggers back, and when the men finally look up to the coffin, they see Lucy's features have gone back to the sweet look they used to have. The men all feel relief as they now know that Lucy can go to heaven. Van Helsing approaches Arthur to ask for forgiveness, and Arthur kisses his hand and tearfully thanks him. Van Helsing tells Arthur that at last he's allowed to kiss Lucy on the lips like she would have wanted, then to wait outside with Quincy. Now, this is nice, but the book specifically states that her lips are covered in blood because she bit them so hard when she was being staked, so it's also a bit gross. Once Quincy and Arthur are out, Van Helsing and Seward saw off the top of the stake so it's left in Lucy's body, then cut off her head and fill her mouth with garlic. This part was probably unnecessary, especially when you get later in the book, but I guess it's better to be safe. Medusa comparisons are coming in hot here. The doctors then solder the coffin lid shut and finally leave the tomb. Outside, Van Helsing returns the tomb key to Arthur and tells them all that they've completed the worst part, but now they need to find the creature that did this to Lucy and stamp it out. He'll be returning to Amsterdam that evening, but in a few days they're all going to meet again along with 2 other people who will help them, and then he'll explain everything. The other 3 men all promise him to do their duty to the bitter end, and they part ways. Seward goes with Van Helsing back to his hotel where they find a telegram waiting from Mina. It says that she's coming to London with important news and that Jonathan is currently in Whitby. Van Helsing is delighted as he's Mina's number 2 fan and tells Seward to go meet her at the station and arrange for the Harkers to stay with him at the asylum, as that's where they'll make their base of operations. He updates Seward about the Harker diaries and gives him the typewritten copies to read before he gets back from Amsterdam. Van Helsing is also aware that Seward has been keeping a diary too and intends for everyone to go through them all when they all meet. Van Helsing sets off for Amsterdam while Seward makes his way to Paddington Station to collect Mina. He's a bit worried he might miss her, but Mina sidles up to him and asks him if he's Dr. Seward. He's surprised she knew who he was, and she lets slip that she recognised him from Lucy's description in the letters about the proposals, which embarrasses her, but when she sees Seward is also embarrassed, they both feel more at ease with each other. Seward takes her luggage and sees that she's brought a typewriter and telegrams ahead for his servants to prepare rooms for Mina. They make their way to the asylum and Mina asks if she can join him in his study, to which he agrees, and he takes the opportunity to update his diary while she gets ready. Seward wants to keep her busy with something for the time being, as he still hasn't had a chance to read all the papers Van Helsing gave him. He's not sure how much he should reveal to Mina about what's been going on, because she's a sweet-faced, dainty girl who he doesn't want to frighten. Switching now to Mina's POV, she's surprised to find Seward alone in his room as she heard him speaking to someone. He informs her that he was just updating his diary via phonograph, though he only really puts details about his cases in it. Mina is delighted and asks if she can hear it, especially as she wants to hear how poor Lucy died, which absolutely horrifies Seward. Mina starts to get a bad feeling as he stutters out an excuse that he wouldn't be able to select a specific part to listen to, though finds it quite funny when she sees him suddenly realise that, actually yeah, what was I going to do about finding specific sections of this diary? He realises he's given himself away, but when Mina offers to typewrite out his diary for him again, he immediately cries out that he can't let her know the details of all the terrible things that happened. Mina susses out that he knows something about Dracula and spots her and Jonathan's diaries. She asks him to read them both, as once he reads them and knows her, he'll be able to trust her. Seward apologises for his rudeness and takes out a few cylinders of his earlier diary entries and tells her she can listen to those as they don't have too many horrifying details, and she'll be able to know him better as well. He sets Mina up at a little table in the sitting room he prepared for her, and they both settle down to learn the other person's stories. Seward gets so wrapped up in reading both the Harker diaries that he doesn't notice the time passing for dinner. As Mina still hasn't come down yet, he asks the servants to wait another hour, thinking she must be tired from her journey. She finally comes down just as he's finished reading her diary, and he notices she's been crying, which moves him. Mina tells him she was touched by his grief when she was listening to him speak, and that she typewrote everything out so no one else needs to listen to something so personal to him. Seward says no one else ever needs to know what was in his diary, but she corrects him and tells him they all need to know because it's part of the story of Lucy's death and will help them figure out what to do about Dracula. She tells him how she and Jonathan have been working round the clock to suss out more information since they last saw Van Helsing, and that Jonathan has gone to Whitby specifically to gather more information for them all. She tells him they can't have secrets and are stronger together than if some people were left in the dark. If only these men would listen. You'll see soon enough. Seward gives in straight away and, after dinner, moves her setup to his study and gives her the rest of the phonograph entries to listen to. He sits in a corner to read and gives her some space while she settles in. Once she's finished, she is completely stunned, only able to take comfort in the fact that her Lucy is now at peace. Seward is alarmed when he sees her and gives her some brandy to bring her back to herself. Mina feels like if she hadn't known about what was in Jonathan's diary, she would never have believed Seward's story. She gets her typewriter to distract herself and document everything, and it's pretty much confirmed here that the in-universe explanation for how this book is set up in terms of the epistolary narrative is because of Mina writing everything out and organising it chronologically. She makes 3 copies of Seward's diary like she did for all the other diaries, then gets all the newspaper clippings to put them with the diary entries as well. Seward goes to the station the next day to collect Jonathan and is surprised to see that he's a quiet, business-like man, as opposed to the good specimen of manhood he was expecting from reading Jonathan's journal. You know, Seward, it's a bit suspicious how obsessed you are with other men's manhood. Suspicious. They go back to the asylum, and Seward hears the Harkers hard at work. Jonathan has managed to get his hands on all the letters regarding the boxes of dirt at Whitby and London, whilst Mina is adding the letters to the chronology of the story. Truly a power couple. Seward sees Jonathan reading his diary and wonders what the two of them make of it. Jonathan updates him about the current chronology of events. So, whilst Jonathan was in Whitby, he was able to find out that Dracula brought 50 boxes of dirt over from Transylvania. When he saw the letters to the solicitors and shipping companies, he felt a chill thinking back to the last time he saw them on Dracula's table and realised how carefully the whole thing had been planned out from the start. He followed the trail back to London and bribed workers with drinks to get some more information, and found out that all 50 boxes of dirt had indeed been delivered to Carfax next door, but from Seward's diary is worried about the boxes which were being taken away by the men Renfield previously attacked. He plans to follow up with the delivery men at some point to try and trace where the boxes could have gone. Seward is struck by the realisation that Dracu's hiding place is most likely the house next door to the asylum, and is kicking himself for not figuring out earlier. He's also very upset by the additional realisation that if they'd had all this information put together earlier, they might have had a chance to save Lucy's life, but shuts down the thought to avoid driving himself mad. Jonathan tells him to go check on Renfield because he seems to be a marker for Dracula's activity, and while Seward doesn't really see it at the moment, he thinks about how lucky it is that Mina has sorted out all the dates to make things clearer. Seward finds Renfield suspiciously calm and is surprised when Renfield suddenly starts talking about his discharge from the asylum. Renfield is so confident that Seward thinks that he would have just charged him if he hadn't spoken to the Harkers already about Renfield's outbursts and their corresponding dates. For now, he doesn't say anything to Renfield as he's suspicious of his quiet moods, and instead tells the attendants to have a straitjacket ready for Renfield in case they need it. Returning to Mina's POV, she's extremely glad to see how well Jonathan seems to have recovered and that he is once again full of life and determination. She almost feels sorry for Dracula for being so hunted now, but thinks about Lucy and all the pity disappears. Arthur and Quincy arrive a bit earlier than expected whilst Jonathan and Seward are out, so Mina goes down to greet them instead. It's a difficult meeting as she can't help but be reminded about all of poor Lucy's hopes and dreams, and the men are a little awkward too because they're not sure how much she knows and what they should say. Mina decides the best thing to do is get them both up to speed, so gives them both copies of the chronology up to date and informs them that she's aware of everything that's happened. Arthur is impressed at the documents she's written up and starts to break down a little when he thinks of how much Mina also loved his Lucy. Quincy picks up on this and quietly gives them some space, and Arthur feels free to cry. Mina sits beside him and comforts him, telling him how much she loved Lucy and how they were like sisters. She asks him to also think of her as a sister and to come to her for support whenever he needs for Lucy's sake. This causes the floodgates to open and all of Arthur's pent-up grief comes pouring out. He cries like a child for a while on Mina's shoulder, and Mina just strokes his head. Once he's finally got everything out, he apologises and thanks Mina for her kindness, asking her to also consider him a brother and depend on him for the rest of their lives, again for Lucy's sake and her own. Mina gives him some space and leaves the room to find Quincy looking out the window. He asks how Arthur is and sees Mina has also been crying, so thanks her for comforting Arthur. I really like how Arthur isn't shamed for breaking down and expressing his grief, though I think it's a shame how all the characters keep going on about how only a woman would be able to comfort him properly. I'm just saying that I think men should be able to comfort other men without any shame, but that's just me. Anyway, Mina also feels really sorry for Quincy and sees he's got the manuscript with him, so realises that once he reads it, he'll realise that she knows all about his proposal to Lucy. She wants to offer him support as well, so asks to be his friend and for him to let her comfort him too if he ever needs it. Quincy gets a bit emotional, so he takes Mina's hand and kisses it, and she feels like that probably isn't enough to actually comfort him, so she also gives him a kiss, and he gets teary-eyed, promising that as long as she lives, he'll be there for her as a friend. Platonic insta-love strikes again. Once Seward gets back, he sees that not only have Arthur and Quincy already arrived, but they've both read all of the manuscript Mina gave them. Jonathan hasn't returned from chasing the lead about the boxes, so Mina makes them all some tea and asks Seward if she can visit Renfield. She's very interested in seeing him from all of Seward's diary entries, and Seward is unable to refuse. They go down together and Seward goes in first to tell Renfield a lady would like to see him. Renfield is confused why, but shrugs and agrees. He asks Seward to wait a minute whilst he tidies the place up, and then before Seward can stop him, he just swallows all the spiders and flies in his room. I love Renfield so much. He's so funny. I love this character. Anyway, once he's finished eating his bugs, he cheerfully sits on his bed and tells Seward to let the lady come in. Seward is briefly suspicious about whether Renfield has some homicidal intent, so he positions himself in a way that he can easily grab Renfield if he tries to jump Mina. Mina comes in and greets Renfield, holding out her hand for him to shake. He's initially suspicious of her, but then straight up asks Mina if she's the one that Seward wanted to marry, but then dismisses it because no, that girl is dead. Mina sweetly responds by saying no, she already has a husband, and that she and Jonathan are staying with Seward for a while, and Renfield flatly tells her she shouldn't stay. Seward, meanwhile, is astonished that Renfield even knew he wanted to marry anyone, but when he asks Renfield how he knows all this, Renfield just scoffs and calls him an idiot. When Mina disagrees and politely repeats the question, he apologises and gives a long, eloquent speech about how news travels fast in their small community at the asylum. He then goes on for a while, which bewilders Seward even more because his, to quote him directly, pet lunatic is talking philosophy like an educated gentleman. He wonders if it's because of Mina's influence and is once again astounded when Mina asks him about the flies and he explains it to her in great detail. Now, I can understand Seward's confusion because I too would be shocked that a guy who just ate a bunch of spiders and flies was talking about philosophy, but let it be known that I would still not hesitate to fight this man. Seward checks his watch and realises he needs to move things along as Van Helsing is arriving soon, so Mina says her goodbyes to Renfield and hopes they'll meet again. Renfield cheerfully replies that he hopes he never sees her again and God bless. Seward leaves Mina, Arthur and Quincy at the asylum to go collect Van Helsing from the station, noting Arthur and Quincy both seem to be more cheerful and like their usual selves. He gets Van Helsing up to speed, especially on how Mina has organised all of their data chronologically. Van Helsing once again has many compliments for Mina, but then ruins it by saying it's because she has a gifted man's brain. On top of this, he tells Seward that after tonight she shouldn't be involved any further in this business. Basically, he thinks the risk is too great and might affect her womanly nerves too much. Also, since she was recently married, she might become pregnant or be pregnant already. Like, bro, I'm trying so hard to defend you here. Seward, of course, agrees with this, somehow forgetting the only reason they have the knowledge they do now is because Mina did all the work putting the pieces together. Literally no one else thought to do this for some reason, so clearly you lot have a deficiency that you need Mina around to fill. This is also why Lucy got by Dracula, you know, because you fools kept not telling the women anything. Even Van Helsing laments that if they had known all of this before, they could have saved Lucy, once again confirming they need Mina, but whatever, I guess. When they get to the asylum, they're greeted by Mina, and she tells them everything in the chronology is up to date up to this morning. Van Helsing asks why it's not updated to the current moment, which embarrasses Mina, and she hands him her journal entries from earlier where she comforted Arthur and Quincy, and asks him if she really has to put it in. Van Helsing says she doesn't have to, but hopes she will, and that she doesn't need to be embarrassed because all the men will only think higher of her for being their angel. Paraphrased, of course. Once dinner is over and everyone has read up to speed, they all gather in Dr. Seward's study for an Avengers meeting on how to deal with Dracula. Van Helsing gives a history lesson on what he's dug up on Dracula's background, admitting that even he was skeptical about his existence before he saw Vampire Lucy. He again laments how they could have saved Lucy's life if they'd known what they do now, and vows to make sure no one else ever suffers the same fate. I will say that I really appreciate how Lucy's death continues to affect the narrative, and the group really are only this motivated to kill Dracula because of what he did to her. I hate how sometimes when characters die, everyone just forgets about it, even when they're supposed to be really important to people. I think Fullmetal Alchemist is another really good example of character deaths continuing to have a big impact on the narrative. Van Helsing goes on to list what he believes are Draki's powers, including, but not limited to, immortality, consuming blood to regain youth, super strength, mind control / hypnosis, control of the elements, shape-shifting, including animals and mist, control over animals, like wolves and bats, changing his size, no reflections or shadows, night vision. This bit is very long and goes on for a couple of pages, but it's interesting to see where a lot of things in pop culture has trickled down from. I also thought it was interesting how Dracula actually can hang out during the day, it's just he doesn't have his powers, and the burning up in sunlight thing I think was added later. Everyone has a heroic Fellowship of the Ring moment where they pledge themselves to defeat Dracula. Van Helsing is obviously Gandalf. After that, Van Helsing goes on to another list of ways Dracula can be defeated, including but not limited to the power of friendship, the sun, specifically how Dracula's shapeshifting is limited by noon, sunrise and sunset, and inability to pass running water freely, reliance on unhallowed ground as a place of safety, crucifixes and the communion bread, science, garlic, guns, stakes, beheading. We also get a little tidbit here about how Dracula is likely Vlad Tepes, aka Vlad the Impaler, Draci V if you will. Van Helsing then tells the group that Dracula was probably a necromancer who made a deal with the devil to become a vampire or something like that. He says their best bet is to find where Dracula sleeps, trap him, then deal with him during noon and sunset when he'll be weakest. They'll start off today by going next door to see if all 50 boxes are still there, and if not, track them all down. In the midst of all this, Mina notices that Quincy gets up and quietly goes out of the room, and a little while later a pistol shot crashes through the window and hits the back wall. Everyone jumps up and Arthur throws back the curtain to reveal Quincy with a smoking gun outside. He apologises and comes back in, saying he saw a bat hanging out by the window and shot at it because he's recently taken a disliking to them. Unfortunately, the bat flew off into the woods. Now, none of the characters acknowledge this and just carry on with their conversation like people. Were you not just discussing how Dracula can turn into a bat? Maybe it was a normal bat, but I doubt. Surely there's at least something to be concerned about here, right? Like, he literally knows your plans now, and after that they just decide that Mina is too precious and delicate to come along further with any of their plans, so they send her off to bed whilst all the men go to Carfax to investigate Dracula's house. At this point, Mina thinks how it isn't right that they put themselves in danger, blah blah blah, to protect her, blah blah blah, and how chivalrous they all are, blah blah blah, and doesn't make a fuss, especially because she's worried they might exclude her from future meetings. She goes to bed, or at least tries to, whilst the men all get ready to go vampire hunting next door. So now you have a split party. It's 4 a.m. when you know Dracula will be up, as you've just discussed. Dracula knows all of your plans, and you're leaving your precious Mina alone in a mental asylum with Renfield. I'm sure absolutely nothing will go wrong with this. After this, we switch to Seward's POV just before the boy band is about to head out, and he gets a message from an attendant that Renfield wants to see him urgently. He decides to go down because the staff are worried that Renfield will have another violent outburst if Seward waits until the morning, and one by one, the boy band all decide that they want to see him too because they're curious from the previous notes in Seward's diary. So they all go down to see Renfield, and when they get there, they get a big shock because not only is Renfield extremely lucid and pleasant towards them all, he actually knows a whole bunch about all of them and gives a long fancy speech freaking them all out. He essentially tries to appeal to Seward that he's no longer insane and wants to be discharged right this moment and is no longer mad, and Seward almost verbally agrees that they'll put the plans into place. My guy, you've literally seen him do this before and then eat a bunch of spiders. Luckily, Seward maintains at least some of his sense and says they'll discuss it in the morning, so Renfield then asks to change his request to leaving just as one evening, but won't tell them why, saying he's not his own master, making Seward even more suspicious and denying his request. Seward then starts begging them to let him out, saying he can't tell them but he's fighting for his soul. After that, he just gives up, and as they all leave, he tells Seward to bear in mind that he tried to convince him once the consequences of tonight are revealed. I know he eats spiders, but I feel really bad for Renfield here. Again, it's probably not a good idea to go Draci hunting at 4 a.m. when you know he's up. With that all out the way, the group goes to Draci's house, all decked out in crucifixes and garlic. They find the chapel where they think he is and are overwhelmed with a terrible stench when they get inside. They make a start by checking on how many boxes there are and accidentally trigger a rat trap. Luckily, Arthur had a plan for this and summons his dogs and gets them to fight the rats, causing most of them to flee. Once the rats are gone, the chapel feels a bit less oppressive and they search the rest of the house for the boxes. When day finally breaks, they congratulate themselves on a successful mission on information gathering and decide to completely leave their sweet Mina out of all their future plans, including their meetings, because they're just smart like that. Jonathan is at least a bit reluctant, as he and Mina have never had secrets from each other before, but is convinced by the others that it's for her own good. Jonathan goes back to his and Mina's room and notes that she looks paler this morning, which makes him very glad they're going to exclude her now because it'll be too much for her. You absolute flipping moron, man. I wonder why she looks so pale, when you guys were raiding Draci's empty house? Pale like Lucy, I think. It is too great a strain for a woman to bear. Idiot. Like, honestly, I know he's a good husband who cares about his wife, but you should really know by now that secrecy only causes problems. He reaffirms to himself that he won't tell her anything until everything with Dracula is sorted, and will keep his mouth shut about what happened last night, even if she asks later. To avoid disturbing her in bed, he then decides to go sleep on the couch. The next day, they all wake up late, but Jonathan notes that even though they all slept in, he still woke up before Mina and had to call her multiple times to get her up. When she does finally wake, she's all frightened, so he he decides to just let her keep resting whilst he, Arthur and Quincy all go out on various quests to search for more boxes. They only found 29 in the chapel last night, which means they still have 21 left to locate. In the meantime, Van Helsing has gone to visit Renfield in his cell, but this time Renfield is angry and won't talk to him, so he tells Seward he's going to cheer himself up by hanging out with Mina. Seward also later goes down to bother Renfield once he's finished some of his other work, and Renfield is being weird again, flipping here and there in his... Seward at this point pretty much constantly refers to Renfield as the lunatic and tries to tempt him into talking about Dracula with more spiders and flies, but Renfield's moved on now. He's very cagey with how he's talking, not mentioning drinking and acting like he'll be able to get his hands on something much bigger and more important than a spider, but is worried about being burdened with a soul. Seward finally begins to suspect that Renfield's been visited by Dracula, so he later tells Van Helsing about his suspicions and they decide to watch him closely. Van Helsing also goes on another spiel about how happy he is they're going to be excluding Mina from now on, to which Seward wholeheartedly agrees. He thinks that if they men can barely handle it, then it would absolutely wreck Mina, as it is no place for a woman. Mina, of course, just ends up agreeing and goes on about how those strong men are protecting her, but at least admits she's upset about the secrecy from Jonathan for the first time in their relationship. She also blames herself for Lucy's demise, as she thinks that because she visited Whitby and brought Lucy to the graveyard during the day, that's what caused Lucy to sleepwalk there at night and catch Dracula's attention. And I suppose it's true that Lucy would have never been targeted by Dracula if she hadn't sleepwalked to the graveyard, but it's not really either of their faults. Mina also notes in her diary how last night she saw a mist coming up to the house, and that Renfield had been screaming the place down. On top of that, she doesn't remember how she fell asleep, but felt weighed down. Oh, and also, she saw a white face with red eyes looming over her. Wow, girl, I wonder what this sounds like. I wonder who you all discussed can turn into mist and has a white face with red eyes. Maybe from the notes you read literally yesterday, the notes where your best friend Lucy went through the exact same thing before she was drained of all her blood and turned into a vampire. But of course, Mina just talks about how it was all such a terrible dream and she doesn't want to mention it to the men and add to their worries. I swear, I feel like there's a bit of author intervention here, because sometimes these people are so smart and other times they're all so stupid. After dinner, the men all just send her off to bed again, like a child, so they can discuss their plans further without her, and all she does is ask Seward to give her some opiate soup as a sleeping draught so she can try and get a better night's rest. Like, girl, you know who owns the house next door. Be more concerned. Jonathan, in the meantime, thinks she looks even more worn and scared than before, and feels guilty about keeping stuff from her, so decides to remedy this by sending her back to Exeter tomorrow so she doesn't have to watch them exclude her and will hopefully feel better. Like, where is the logic in this? He thinks that it must be her womanly sensibilities that are making her so scared from all this vampire business, and it's a good thing they decided to exclude her from all their plans just in time. They're so stupid. Like, they're all so stupid. This part is so hard to stomach. Definitely my least favourite part of this book, but they'll all realise how stupid they are soon enough. Okay, rant over. Once Mina is sent off, Jonathan tells the group about his search for the boxes and how he's managed to locate a bunch of them at a different house in Piccadilly. They realise they're going to have to break into another property, but this time it's in the middle of a busy area, so they might actually get spotted and get in trouble this time. They spend another day or two at the asylum trying to figure out how to break into Dracula's other house, and Seward notes late in the evening that Renfield has quietened down again. Suddenly he hears a cry and is urgently called to Renfield's room, where Seward finds him lying on the ground in a pool of his own blood, having been attacked. Seward gets the attendant to summon Van Helsing before sending the attendant away, and Arthur and Quincy also come down, having heard the man fetching Van Helsing. Renfield is unconscious on the floor, and Van Helsing notes that he has a brain bleed, so does an impromptu operation on him by drilling a hole in his skull. Fun fact, they actually still do this today to treat epidural and subdural hematomas, and it's called burr hole surgery, and the technique has been used since the prehistoric age, though luckily the survival rate has improved, which is nice. Renfield finally wakes up and initially tries to tell them about the horrible dream that he just had, but then admits that no, it was all real and that he needs to tell them something before he dies. He starts by first informing them about what happened on the first night when he asked Seward to discharge him. Dracula did indeed come to visit him and promised him lots of rats if Renfield worshipped him and invited him into the asylum, which he did. Unfortunately, Dracula lied and didn't send him any rats. In fact, he didn't even send him a single fly. When he came back on the second night, Renfield tells the group that Dracula smelled like Mina, which alarms the four men. He says that when Mina came to visit him yesterday, she looked pale, like all her blood had run out, and that he thinks Dracula had taken it. That made him angry. So this evening, when Dracula came back, Renfield tried to stop him and failed as Dracula attacked him, leaving him in his current state. The men all realise that Dracula is now currently in the asylum and after Mina, so they deck themselves out in garlic and crucifixes again and run up to the Harker's room. They turn the handle but aren't able to get in, so throw themselves against the door to break it down. Inside, they find Mina kneeling on the edge of the bed with Dracula beside her and Jonathan asleep on the bed in a stupor. Dracula is holding Mina down and forcing her to drink his blood from his chest. When Dracula sees the other men, he flies into a rage and flings Mina away to attack the group, so Van Helsing throws an envelope containing the communion bread at him. The men advance on Dracula, which forces him to turn into a mist and flee, leaving the entire group in disarray. Quincy immediately runs out after Dracula, following him out the house, and the other three men rush forward to Mina. Mina, of course, is covered in blood and absolutely traumatized whilst Jonathan is still asleep, so Van Helsing and Seward wake him, whilst Arthur, knowing there isn't anything he can do for either of the Harkers at the moment, runs out after Quincy to chase Dracula. Seward raises the blind to get some light in and can see Quincy running outside across the lawn. From behind him, he hears Jonathan exclaim as he wakes up and comes to his senses. As soon as Jonathan realises what happened, he goes absolutely wild and is ready to go fight Dracula with his bare fists, but Mina grabs him and forces him to stay with her as she's terrified he'll be hurt. Jonathan agrees in order to avoid causing her more distress, and Van Helsing gives Mina his crucifix to try and reassure her. Unfortunately, Mina is just absolutely distraught, going on about how she's unclean now and is unfit to touch or kiss Jonathan ever again, which honestly is so sad. Jonathan, of course, being the absolute man who loves his wife, is like, I do not think so, so don't ever say something like that again, and please forgive me if I ever make you feel that way, and he just gives her a massive hug. Like, period accurate misogyny aside, I really love Jonathan and Mina's relationship, because despite their flaws, it's so clear that they love each other so much and would do anything for each other, and I just think that's nice. Anyway, absolute man Jonathan gets the other two to tell him exactly what happened whilst he strokes his wife's hair and is understandably fuming about the whole thing. Arthur and Quincy eventually also come back into the room, but unfortunately they weren't able to find Dracula anywhere. Arthur hesitates for a moment about sharing some stuff in front of Mina, but Van Helsing tells him to go on as they won't be concealing things from each other anymore, like I said. And I really like how they all acknowledge how stupid and dangerous it was to keep people in the dark about things like this. They all left Mina out to try and keep her safe, which wound up causing her to experience something even worse. If she had been with them on the first night when they went to Carfax, Dracula wouldn't have targeted her while she was alone at the asylum, and she probably would have felt more comfortable sharing details about her dreams and experiences. Anyway, Arthur lets them all know that though he wasn't able to catch him, Dracula had actually ransacked Seward's study and destroyed all their notes. Fortunately, Seward kept a copy in a safe, so they didn't lose everything. Arthur also lets them know that he passed Renfield's room, but Renfield had died from his injuries. R.I.P. Renfield, you were a real one, and I'm sorry everyone treated you so badly. He may have eaten a load of spiders and flies, and attempted homicide a couple of times, but in the end, he spent his last moments trying to defend Mina, and he deserves props for that. Quincy also chips in and tells them that he saw a large bat fly out of Renfield's room and in the opposite direction of Carfax, and says they need to destroy the boxes of dirt today. Van Helsing asks Mina to tell them all in detail what happened to her that evening, and she says that after she took the sleeping draught, she initially couldn't sleep, but then nodded off and woke up in the middle of the night with Jonathan sleeping next to her. She tried to wake him up when she noticed the same mist in the corner of the room, but it was like he was under some kind of spell. Suddenly the mist turned into Dracula, and he spoke to her and told her to keep quiet or he'd brain Jonathan then and there. Dracula then grabbed her neck and drank her blood to refresh himself, mocking her for trying to help the men kill him. Mina says that she was confused, that she didn't even want to stop him, and thinks it was all part of the curse that falls on Dracula's victims, sort of like how Lucy kept trying to sleepwalk out again to Dracula in Whitby after the first time he drank her blood. Dracula then told Mina that first he would punish her for helping the men, and forced her to drink his blood from his chest as it would make her be actively under his command, and that eventually he was going to make her one of his wives and essentially be his puppet for eternity, going against the people she loves. Jonathan listens to all this and is so angry and horrified that his hair starts to turn white. After this, everyone mutually agrees that Mina will be included in all of the plans from now on with no further secrets, and Mina tells them all that she's going to take her own life if she feels a sign coming up that she thinks she'll harm the people she loves. This is a huge deal, as people back then believed that taking your own life would condemn you to hell, and it shows that she's willing to condemn herself just to save the people that she cares about. Van Helsing convinces her that she has to live, especially whilst Dracula is still alive, as she'll turn into a vampire otherwise, so then she agrees. They plan to use this day to find the rest of the boxes and also deal deal with the ones they previously found in Carfax, in case Dracula realises what they plan to do. Jonathan is chomping at the bit to get going, but Van Helsing tells him to calm down and that they have to be very careful about how they get into the Piccadilly house. He suggests that rather than obviously breaking in, they pretend to just be the owners and employ a locksmith to open the door at a decent time of day and essentially just fake it till they make it, reasoning being that if they look like they're supposed to be there, no police will question them, and Dracula is unlikely to show up and be like, that's my house actually. The plan is for the men to all go to the Piccadilly house in case they find Dracula there, and then all split off to find and deal with any missing boxes as required. Mina, in the meantime, will stay at the asylum with all their records to sort them all out again like she did before. Before they go, Van Helsing tries to prepare a protected room for Mina, all decked out with garlic, so she can stay there until sunset when they all come back. He tries to bless her by touching the sacred wafer to her forehead, but it ends up burning her and leaving a mark, indicating that she's already affected by Dracula's curse. This again sends Mina into another panic, whilst Jonathan comforts her and the rest of the men shed a few tears over her predicament. Van Helsing then gives a rousing speech and everyone gathers on the ground to pray and pledge themselves to each other, with all the men especially pledging themselves to save Mina. I have to say now that whilst this is all very nice, I can't help but feel like it's a bit dramatic given that 4 of the 5 men have probably only known Mina for about a week at this point, but I guess the Victorians go hard, you know? Also, I'm not 100% sure because the language is a bit harder to understand at this point, but I think Jonathan also decides to himself that if Mina becomes a vampire and is doomed, then he's going to join her because he won't let her go through hell alone. And again, I would just like to take a moment to applaud Jonathan for being husband of the year. Despite being the one most terrorised by the vampires, he'll still willingly become a vampire to be with his wifey because he loves her so much. Like, both of these two are willing to go to hell for the other, and I genuinely don't understand why anyone would want a Dracula over a Jonathan. Make it make sense. So after all that, the men go back to Carfax and search it more closely for papers before sterilising all the earth in the boxes by placing a piece of sacred wafer into each of the boxes. The boy band then catch a train to Piccadilly where Jonathan updates his diary, and then Arthur and Quincy go to get the locksmith to break into the house, whilst the other 3 go loiter in a park until they get the signal to come in. The whole thing goes off without a hitch since Arthur is rich and a lord, so he's able to wave the policeman off when he comes round. Oh, to be born with generational wealth. Anyway, once that's sorted out, the remaining 3 come in and they search the house, finding 8 of the 21 remaining boxes. They sterilise the boxes just like they did to the ones at Carfax, and then, when it's obvious that Dracula isn't in, search through the rest of his stuff for any clues about the other boxes. They find the addresses to 2 other houses and some keys, so Arthur and Quincy set out again to find and destroy any boxes at those locations, whilst the remaining 3 men wait at the Piccadilly house. Van Helsing theorises, whilst they wait, that Dracula has been experimenting with his powers and has gradually been getting stronger, so they need to destroy him soon before he becomes unstoppable. Jonathan is once again chomping at the bit to destroy him, saying he would happily sell his soul to do it. They're interrupted by a knock at the door, and it turns out to be a telegram from Mina telling them that Dracula is on the move and they need to be careful. Now, they don't acknowledge how she knows this, but it's later revealed that because Dracula forced her to drink his blood, they now have a connection where she can, I guess, see through his eyes and track his movements. They hear another knock at the door and prepare themselves, thinking it's Dracula, but it's actually just Arthur and Quincy back from their side quest. They found a total of 12 boxes at each of the locations and destroy them, leaving only 1 missing box of dirt. They all decide to stay at the Piccadilly house until 5 PM just in case Dracula returns, as they want to ambush him whilst he's still powerless, but plan to return to Mina at the asylum before sunset and Dracula gets the advantage again. They hear a key turning in the lock and Quincy takes charge, arranging them all into battle formation as they wait for the door to open. Dracula leaps into the room and the men all attack him, with Jonathan being especially vicious and charging ahead with his knife. The men notice a red scar on Dracula's forehead just before he makes an escape by grabbing some money and jumping out the window, running to the stables. Right before he goes, however, Dracula turns back and threatens the men, saying he'll have his revenge on them over the centuries, and that the women they love are already his, and that they'll force his power, etc, etc. I don't think Dracula knew at this point that they'd already dealt with Vampire Lucy. Van Helsing decides to burn anything left in the house that might be useful for the Count, and they head back to Mina at the asylum as they're unable to follow Dracula through the stable. Jonathan, in particular, is very upset that they weren't able to get Dracula, as it's another day that Mina is in danger. Once back, they update Mina and she gives them a rousing speech asking them to have pity for Dracula. Jonathan is like, I will destroy him, but Mina tells him that one day she might be the same as Dracula and she wants them to have mercy for her in that case. Everyone then cries, and Seward goes on for a few paragraphs about how Mina is an angel sent from heaven, etc, etc, and the other men give the couple some space, with Van Helsing fixing up their room with garlic to try and make it safe for Mina. Jonathan gets woken up that night by Mina, who can hear someone outside their door, but when Jonathan goes to check, he finds it's just Quincy, as the other men have all decided to set up a shift watch to avoid taking any more chances. Jonathan goes back to reassure Mina, and as he can't sleep, also takes a moment to update his diary about how she's an angel, etc, etc. The next morning, Mina wakes Jonathan up just before dawn and says she urgently needs to speak to Van Helsing. She asks Van Helsing to hypnotise her quickly before dawn, as she believes she'll be able to speak freely at sunrise without Dracula's influence. Once hypnotised, she tells everyone that she can't see anything, but she can hear the sounds of water and men. The group all realise that Draki is on a ship back to Transylvania with his last box of dirt, and that he's trying to run away from them. They take a moment to breathe, as they now know Dracula is no longer in the same country as them, and Mina asks Van Helsing if they can just forget everything and move on. Van Helsing tells her that, unfortunately, since Dracula drunk her blood and can live for centuries, when she dies, even if it's of old age, she'll end up like him, which causes her to faint. Now, at this point, I'm wondering why she didn't clock this earlier, because it was definitely mentioned before. But again, I just feel like these characters have a bit of a goldfish memory, where things get established and then they all immediately forget until someone spells it out for them again, or maybe I'm just stupid, but I swear she already had this information. Van Helsing, Seward, Arthur and Quincy all end up heading back out to gather information about which boat Dracula took, whilst Jonathan and Mina stay back to prep notes. They have another meeting that evening where Van Helsing tells them all that they've discovered that Draki is on a boat called the Tsarina Catherine, headed for Varna, which is a city in Bulgaria. Now, the speech he gives is quite long, as they bribed the people at the dock and got an account of all Draki's movement, and it's actually quite funny because he keeps describing how the captain swore polyglot with bloom and blood, and speak with tongues, which I think is just Van Helsing trying to convey that they kept swearing like sailors and using the phrases blooming and bloody. But overall, it goes on for a long time and is quite funny, which is why I will forever maintain that this book is a comedy. Their plan is that they're going to chase after Dracula via land whilst he's at sea, and head him off at the destination to hopefully get to him during the day whilst he's still in the box. They figure that they now have roughly 2 weeks to prepare before setting off for Varna, as it'll take Dracula 3 weeks by ship, but roughly only 5 days for them over land, though the plan is to set off in a few days' time and wait in Varna for him. They think it's too dangerous for Mina to go with them, so they plan for her to stay in England with Jonathan, who will protect her, meaning it'll just be the 4 other men going off without the Harkers. Seward and Van Helsing, in the meantime, come to the conclusion that since Mina can see what Dracula is seeing and thinking, then likely the opposite is probably true, and they decide to keep their plans hidden from her again, though this time it's to prevent Dracula from knowing what their plans are, rather than because of period-accurate misogyny. Mina has also figured out this point and makes Jonathan promise not to tell her anything or even imply anything about their plans. The group have all noticed that Mina has become more restricted in what she can and can't say unless it's sunrise or sunset. She later calls Van Helsing to her again and tells him that they all have to take her on their journey with them, as she says Dracula could force her to come to him at any moment, even in secret, and there would be nothing she could do to stop it. She also tells Van Helsing that she can help them with their plans, as they can keep hypnotising her to keep tabs on Draki. Van Helsing agrees to the logic of this, so they all settle their affairs and write their wills in case they don't make it back. Mina gives another rousing speech to the men, which is ripe for Adam and Eve literary analysis, and asks the men to end her life if they think she's becoming too vampire-y, so they all kneel and swear it to her. She also asks Jonathan to read her the burial service because she's convinced she's gonna die, and it's all so dramatic. Seward also writes another sappy speech, and this whole bit is just so men writing women, because Mina literally says it's men's duty to slay those they love to prevent them from falling into the hands of the enemy. And I'm like, you know, I totally get it, how in certain situations death is absolutely better than the alternative, especially for women, but it is weird to me how the male author made the only female character be the one to say this message. Though I suppose you could argue that Mina's deciding that she's going to die on her own terms, but frankly I think we're getting too much into literary analysis territory here, so we're just going to move on. So the group set off for Varna on the train, and they hypnotise Mina every sunrise and sunset during their travels, and also once they get there, in order to check that Dracula is still on the Tsarina Catherine. Van Helsing in particular keeps an eye on her teeth in case they start to sharpen. Eventually they receive a telegram to let them know that the Tsarina Catherine has been spotted near Varna, which gets the men all excited except for Jonathan, who now just spends all his time sharpening a huge knife meant for Dracula. This excitement soon dies, however, when they still don't receive any news about the ship docking, despite the fact that it should have done so by now, and Mina, during her hypnosis sessions, tells them that she can still hear running water. They finally receive a telegram a few days later informing them that the Tsarina Catherine arrived in Galatz, which is a city in Romania and not in Varna. This doesn't really surprise anyone, especially Van Helsing, as he suspects that, just like they were using Mina to see through Dracula's eyes and see what he was doing, he could probably see through her eyes too. Mina impresses all the men with her knowledge of train timetables because of her habit of memorising them for Jonathan's travels, and I love this bit because she specifically specifically refers to herself as a train fiend. Unfortunately, the earliest train to Galatz is 6:30 a.m. the next day, so Van Helsing sends the three younger men out on errands to prepare for the journey, whilst he and Seward stay back with Mina. Also, I know I keep calling Seward one of the older men, but he's only 29. Basically, Seward and Van Helsing are still concerned about Mina's condition, and when Mina tells them that she's been feeling freer of Draki's power lately, Van Helsing tells them both that he thinks Dracula has tried to temporarily block his and Mina's connection. Essentially, Dracula is trying to prevent her from knowing where he is and what his next plans are, but being immature and selfish, he doesn't realise that technically Mina can still use their connection to see what he's doing when she's being hypnotised, though this time of her own free will instead of due to Dracula's power. So they hypnotise her again, but because the connection is being blocked, it's a lot harder, but they do manage to figure out that Dracula is nearly on land now. Once they set off for Galatz, the group hypnotise her a few more times, but it gets harder and harder each time until they can no longer hypnotise her in time before the sun rises or sets. After arriving in Galatz, they are finally able to get on board the Tsarina Catherine and speak to the captain, who tells them that it was the fastest journey he'd ever been on, and every time they got close to shore, a fog came in and forced them to keep going. He tells them that a man had come onto the ship midway through the journey with instructions from England to receive a big box before sunrise, and that sends the group on another wild goose chase. They followed the trail of people that the box was passed on to, including the fact that one of them was recently murdered, but are unable to determine exactly what route it's taking to Dracula's castle. This leaves all the men dejected, so when they get back, Mina tells them all to rest for a bit while she collates all their records up to that point with her typewriter. Whilst she's doing this, she essentially figures out Dracula's exact route based on the information she sorted. She works out that Dracula wanted to travel by water as she believes he thought it would be the safest way for him to avoid detection or being caught by the group, especially when he's vulnerable during the day. She says he employed a group of travelling people to move him to his castle, and there's only one river that would take him close enough to his castle, which is probably the one he's going to take. Once again, this impresses all the men, who at this point all essentially worship the ground that she walks on, and once again they make a plan to give chase. Arthur will get a steamboat and chase behind the ship up the river, whilst Quincy will get some horses to chase Draki's boat alongside the river, with Seward volunteering to go with him. They decide that Jonathan, rather than Van Helsing, will go with Arthur in the steamboat, as it's likely whoever is on it will have to fight the people on Dracula's boat to get to Dracula, and Van Helsing is too old. Also, they feel that Dracula has caused the most problems specifically for Jonathan, so he has the greatest right to be the one to end him. Jonathan is basically Blade at this point. Van Helsing reassures Jonathan that he'll take good care of Mina whilst he's on the steamboat, and that whilst the four men are doing their active pursuit, he and Mina will take Jonathan's original route to Dracula's castle and sanctify it to cut him off, using Mina's connection to find their way there. Jonathan is obviously furious at this idea, as he wants Mina nowhere near Dracula's castle, but Van Helsing convinces him by saying that if Dracula escapes them this time, he might choose to go into hiding for a century, and then they may never find him again, and if that happens, Mina will essentially become like Dracula's wives when she dies of old age, and there's nothing they can do to prevent that. Essentially, they have to stop the castle from being a safe haven for Dracula, and also deal with the wives who are still there. I would argue that Mina technically could live out her life, and then they could just stake her as soon as she dies, but I get wanting to deal with Dracula to prevent him from causing more havoc, especially since Mina is technically under his control now. Quincy, as the stereotypical American, bought a buttload of guns with him, and they all get decked out with anti-Drac artillery again. This time, they even give Mina a gun in case she has to fight wolves. Mina makes a comment on the wonderful power of money, which Quincy and Arthur both have lots of. In fact, Arthur straight up manages to acquire a steamboat within 3 hours of them all formulating this plan, and not only that, but he's very good at driving said steamboat because he has 2 of his own back in England. Oh, to be born with generational wealth. Oh, man. So they take the gamble on Mina's guess, knowing that if it's wrong, they're completely screwed, and set off on their individual pursuits. Arthur and Jonathan stop and search each boat they come across, and eventually acquire a Romanian flag and pretend to be a government boat, just to make their searches even easier. They have a minor issue at some rapids, but continue the chase, with Quincy and Seward slowly catching up to them alongside the river. Mina and Van Helsing, meanwhile, make their journey overland, getting a carriage and periodically making stops to switch horses as they get closer to Draki's castle. Mina starts to get more and more lethargic as they go on, which concerns Van Helsing, as he has to start writing in her diary instead to keep records. His alarm gets worse as Mina slowly eats less and less, and starts to stay awake all night and sleep all day without being able to be woken. The hypnosis at this point has also stopped working completely, so they can no longer keep tabs on whether Draki is still on the water. They eventually find Dracula's castle and set up camp nearby, with Van Helsing drawing a large sanctified circle around Mina for protection. He gets her to test it by asking her to try and cross it, but she can't because of of her, quote, vampire baptism, which reassures Van Helsing that Dracula and the wives won't be able to cross it either. That night, Van Helsing starts to see shapes in the snow that look like women, but they stay outside the sanctified ring. He notices the fire dying down and goes to rekindle it, but Mina starts to act strangely. The shapes in the snow suddenly materialise into the wives, who beckon Mina to join them, and Van Helsing starts to fear that Mina has become one of them. But when he turns to look at her, he sees that she's so horrified that he's reassured that it's not too late. He starts advancing on the wives with his sacred wafer and stokes the fire. The wives all laugh at him and kill all their horses. They terrorise the two of them by hanging out just outside the edge of the circle right up until dawn, after which they melt away and go back to the castle. Mina falls into a deep sleep again, and Van Helsing steals himself by making preparations for dealing with the wives and sanctifying the castle. Elsewhere, back on the steamboat, the accident on the rapids has slowed Arthur and Jonathan down so significantly that they haven't been able to catch up with Dracula's boat and have been forced to get horses to continue the chase on land. Returning to Van Helsing, he leaves Mina sleeping in her circle, slightly concerned that she may get eaten by wolves while he's gone, but decides that the vamps are a more pressing concern, so just hopes for the best. Once at the castle, he breaks all the doors down to prevent them from being able to potentially close and lock him in like they did to Jonathan, and starts searching for the graves of the wives. He manages to find one and notes the beauty and voluptuous lips that enthrall him, but is suddenly roused when he hears Mina wail. This snaps him out of it, and he continues to search for the remaining two wives, and also Dracula's empty tomb as well. He puts a piece of communion wafer into Dracula's tomb to prevent Dracula from being able to use it, then stakes and severs the heads of the three wives, almost losing his nerve several times during the process, and the wives' bodies turn into dust. Once that's all done, he sanctifies the entrance to Castle Dracula to prevent Dracula from ever entering it again, and returns to Mina. The two of them then set off to rendezvous back with the others. Mina and Van Helsing find shelter to defend against some wolves which are following them, with Van Helsing setting up another sanctified circle around them, and they spot a group of travelling people in the distance riding hard against the sunset with a large box on a cart. Close behind them they spot Quincy and Seward hot on the group's tail, and not far behind them are Jonathan and Arthur also on horseback. Van Helsing and Mina get their guns ready to help the other men, and also to defend against the wolves, who they can hear getting closer, with the sun also getting lower. The travelling people don't actually seem to realise they're being pursued by the group, and when Quincy and Jonathan both cry out for them to halt, they stop for a moment and are surrounded by the four men. The leader tries to get the rest of his men to go on, but the boy band all raise their guns at the group, and Mina and Van Helsing also pop out from behind their rock and point their guns. In return, the travelling people get out their own weapons, and the leader points to the sunset. The boy band leap off their horses towards the cart, whilst Draki's men try to form a circle to protect it. Jonathan goes full blade and ploughs through all of Draki's men, leaping onto the cart and ripping off the lid. Quincy also tries to force his way through by parrying knives, and does manage to make it onto the cart, but Mina notices he's holding his side with blood spurting out. The two of them manage to get the lid off the box, and seeing this, Dracula's men surrender just as the sun sets. Draki opens his eyes in triumph when both Jonathan and Quincy stab him with their knives through the head and heart respectively, turning him into dust. Mina notes that right before he crumbles away, there's a look of peace on Dracula's face. Dracula's men, on seeing this, jump on their own horses and ride away, pursued by the wolves, leaving the rest of them in the snow. Quincy sinks to the ground as his wound is still bleeding a lot, and they all rush to him, including Mina, who is now able to pass through the sanctified circle. Quincy says his final words, pointing to her forehead where the mark is gone, saying it was all worth it, then passes away. R.I.P. Quincy, you were also a real one, and I'm so sorry that all Dracula adaptations leave you out. This man deserves better. This is where the main timeline of the story ends, and a note is written in Jonathan Harker's journal 7 years later. He and Mina have a son who was born on the same date that Quincy died. They named him after all of the men from their party to honour them, but they call him Quincy, with Mina believing some of Quincy's spirit lives on in him. Jonathan and Mina briefly take a trip to go back to Transylvania for closure, and Arthur and Seward are both happily married now as well. The remaining 5 are all lifelong friends, with Van Helsing coming regularly to visit and play with their son. Jonathan collects all the notes they have on the whole ordeal and plans to keep it for his son to read when he gets older. And that, everyone, is the mostly accurate summary of Dracula. I know I was poking a lot of fun at this book and the characters, especially Seward, but I genuinely do really love this book and the story. If I didn't, I wouldn't have made this video for what will probably be 30 views. I genuinely don't know what possessed me to do this. Probably Dracula. I was debating shortening it and cutting some stuff out, but there were just so many little tidbits that I wanted to keep in, like Mina and Lucy's relationship and the friendship between Arthur, Quincy and Seward. A lot of these characters get done dirty in a lot of adaptations, especially Quincy, who, as I said, gets straight up erased from most of them. Like, give the man some credit, he literally died killing Dracula. And also, as mentioned previously, Lucy and Mina kind of get pitted against each other a little bit, which I really hate. If you're interested or are a fan of gothic horror horror, I cannot recommend this book enough. It's available for free online in written and audiobook form, as well as in most libraries. And whilst vampires aren't really a scary thing these days, the book does have some genuinely creepy moments. As mentioned before, this video is mostly for comedy purposes, so please don't take anything I've said too seriously. At the end of the day, it's also just a really great story with a bit of everything in it. Horror, romance, humour. It kind of reminds me of Brendan Fraser's The Mummy, which is literally one of my favourite movies and is probably why I like this book so much. So well done, Bram Stoker. I was only joking when I said I would fight you, but also I literally know nothing about this man, so RIP if it turns out he was a terrible person. Thank you so much to everyone who got to the end of this video. It took so long to make, but I'm really proud of it, and I would be super grateful if you could leave a like, comment or subscribe if you enjoyed it. I have no idea if I'll ever make something like this again, but I love fantasy stories and I have my own webcomic and other art/storytelling projects that you will find on this channel. Thank you again for watching. Bye!